History remembers crowns, thrones, and empires, but never the footstools they quietly stood on. Tonight, we shrink the lens. This is the untold story of 25 royals who were, quite literally, smaller than legend, allows monarchs, emperors, and iron-fisted rulers who stood barely 5 foot something, yet towered over entire nations. Some rewrote maps, others rewrote myths. Most just rewrote their height in official portraits. But what does it mean when the people who shaped the world could barely reach the top shelf? Because in royal history, the shorter the stature, the taller the story. Welcome to 25 royals who were shockingly short. Before we dive in, take a second to subscribe, especially if you like your history with a twist of irony and a dash of disbelief. While you're at it, drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Are you up at 3 a.m. with tea and insomnia, or sneaking this in on your lunch break? We see you. We're with you. Let's get into it. Queen Victoria, UK. She was 5 feet of absolute inevitability. At least, she used to be. By the time Queen Victoria died in 1901, the monarch who had presided over one of the largest empires in history stood a touch under 4 feet 11 inches. That's not poetic exaggeration. That's what the tape said. She had shrunk almost literally under the weight of her empire. Of course, in the official portraits, you'd never guess it. Dressed in layers of Victorian velvet and moral certainty, seated stiffly beside thrones taller than she was, Victoria looks like a person-sized monument to divine right. But peel away the paintings, the flattery, and the military pageantry, and you find something far stranger. A woman so short, she needed a custom-built step just to get into bed. But who ruled over a quarter of the world. In an age where height equaled dominance, where 6-foot generals plotted colonial conquests, and missionaries preached from high pulpits, Victoria's stature was not just small, it was subversive. Her enemies mocked it, her courtiers disguised it, and her tailors, well, they earned their pay. Yet in private, she leaned into it. She didn't try to grow taller, she tried to grow heavier. After Prince Albert's death in 1861, she reportedly wore black every day for the next 40 years and let herself expand in every direction but up. By the 1,880 seconds, she was an orb of morning, a living eclipse of her younger self. And still, no one dared underestimate her. You could argue that her height helped her in strange, twisted ways. It gave her a kind of theatrical leverage. When she walked into a room, she didn't dominate it physically, she haunted it emotionally. People felt the presence before they noticed the person. The Empress of India, with tiny gloved hands and eyes like damp steel. A grandmother to an empire. A matriarch with enough titles to require their own footstool. And still, the boots of the empire marched forward under her name. There's a peculiar irony to the fact that Queen Victoria ruled over nations that worshipped physical dominance. That British troops swaggered across continents, flattening local rulers and cultures in the name of a woman who couldn't reach the top shelf without assistance. The image itself is almost surreal. African kings surrendering to an empire ruled by someone the height of their average child. But she didn't need to be tall. She was imperial height, a separate category altogether. Her stature didn't need to loom. It lingered. A long shadow cast by a short woman, stretching across oceans and decades, shrinking only in the final years when even monarchs become mortal. By the 1,890 seconds, she was nearly blind, partially deaf, and shrunken to the height of a Victorian nightstand. Still, foreign dignitaries knelt before her. Still, the prime ministers made pilgrimages. Still, she signed orders that reshaped continents. There's something oddly unsettling about it, how absolute power can be held in such small hands. How someone shorter than most of her soldiers still sent them off to wars they wouldn't survive. And yet, it worked. Not in the sense that it was moral, or just, or good, but in the sense that she got away with it. A 4'11" woman presiding over red-drenched maps and industrial massacres. You'd think someone would question it, but they didn't. Or maybe they did, and just not out loud. Even today, the scale of Queen Victoria's empire is hard to process. Her name is stamped on cities, hospitals, bridges, deserts, lakes, mountains. She is eternalized in bronze and marble, her short frame enlarged to heroic scale, towering over public squares she never stepped foot in. It's a fascinating bit of psychological compensation. The monuments are always taller than the monarch. But perhaps the strangest part is how the myth swallowed the measurements. Ask most people how tall Queen Victoria was, and they'll shrug. It's not in the textbooks, it's not in the documentaries, but maybe it should be, because once you realize how small she really was, the story gets far more complicated and far more human. She becomes less of a figurehead and more of a contradiction. A tiny woman with the emotional presence of a thunderstorm, a private widow and a public sovereign, a walking paradox of personal fragility and global control. And if her legacy feels outsized, that's because it islanded every inch of it. Which brings us, awkwardly, to another imperial contradiction. A man so famously short that his name became an insult despite being taller than the queen who reigned longer than him. A man who wasn't really that small, but who ruled like he had something to prove every time he entered a room. Napoleon Bonaparte is next. And he didn't like stairs either. Napoleon Bonaparte. France. Let's get something out of the way. Napoleon wasn't that short. At least, not by today's standards. Most estimates place him between 168 and 170 centimeters, or about 5'6" to 5'7", which, in early 19th century France, was just below average, not laughable. And certainly not the Napoleon caricature we've come to know. The angry, arm-tucked dictator storming around in a temper tantrum, compensating for his height by conquering half of Europe. No, the real Napoleon was small in more complicated, more interesting ways. Not comically short, but strategically underestimated. Not towering, but dense like a historical black hole, sucking the light out of every conversation, every battlefield, every throne room. He wasn't tiny, he was concentrated. But perception is everything, and Napoleon knew it. He was acutely aware that people saw him as petty, not just physically, socially. He was born into minor Corsican nobility, surrounded by taller, better connected, Paris-bred aristocrats who mocked his accent, his manners, his rawness. They made fun of his height. And he remembered. He always remembered. So, he did what small, ambitious men often do in history. He turned himself into a myth, not by growing taller, but by shrinking everything else. He made emperors look irrelevant. He made kings look like hobbyists. He took ancient bloodlines and sent them running, sometimes literally, into exile. And every time someone looked down on him, they eventually found themselves looking up at his army, at his regime, at the scaffold where their old world was being publicly dismantled. And yes, he leaned into the visuals. He wore that now iconic bicorn hat sideways so he'd stand out in a crowd. He surrounded himself with imperial pageantry and dramatic lighting, even when riding into battle. His portraits were more theatre than likeness. The real Napoleon had a stocky build, pale skin, and thinning hair. The painted Napoleon had perfect posture, Greek god limbs, and the gaze of destiny itself. The man was 5'6", his ego was 7'4". There's a certain irony in the fact that the British, his most consistent rivals, were the ones who cemented the myth of his shortness. After his defeat, English propaganda artists delighted in painting him as child-sized, sometimes literally surrounded by oversized British officers. The joke worked because it struck a nerve. Napoleon didn't like being called short, so they called him short, endlessly. It was the 19th century version of a Twitter pile-on. And history lazy, biased, and occasionally petty ran with it. But if you really want to understand Napoleon's relationship to his height, don't look at the cartoons. Look at the battlefield. The man moved like someone who didn't have time for doubts. His strategy was velocity. His genius was clarity. He outmaneuvered armies the way a short man avoids eye contact at a party, quickly, confidently, and always looking for a way out on top. He could memorize entire maps. He could rewrite constitutions before breakfast. He was short on patience, not ability. But what's most fascinating, most quietly tragic, is that his size did seem to haunt him in ways he couldn't quite admit. He famously surrounded himself with unusually tall guards, his imperial guard, many over 6 feet. A subtle, theatrical contrast. He made them wear dramatic uniforms with high boots and tall bearskin hats, which made him look even smaller by comparison, and, more important, he was the eye of the storm. The still point surrounded by spectacle. His wife, Josephine, was reportedly taller than him, and while he tried to present it as charming, a dynamic of passion and control, his private letters tell a different story. He micromanaged her public appearances, her wardrobe, even the height of her shoes. This was not a man indifferent to height. This was a man playing chess with it. As the emperor fell first in Russia, then politically, then literally from power, his size took on a symbolic quality. He went from underestimated general to tragic exile. The man who once ruled Europe spent his final years pacing around the tiny island of St. Helena, surrounded by humid air, hostile guards, and furniture not made to his specifications. When he died, he was buried like a king, re-exhumed like a relic, and reimagined as a paradox, the little man who shook the world. And maybe that's the real mystery. Not that he was short, but that his height became the most talked about thing about him, as if the human brain can't quite compute a small man doing big things, as if we'd rather reduce him to an inch count than confront what he actually did. Which brings us to another ruler with numbers that don't quite add up, a teenage pharaoh who was supposed to be divine but whose body told a different story. Short, fragile, and more myth than man, Tutankhamun ruled ancient Egypt like a footnote, until his corpse became front-page news. If you're still here, 2 royals in, you're our kind of curious. Go ahead and subscribe if you haven't already. This channel's for the ones who question everything, even the height listed on a royal statue. And while we're peeling back layers of historical myth, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Are you tuning in from Tokyo at dawn, or from a midnight couch somewhere in Kentucky? Let us know below. We love seeing how far the mystery travels. Tutankhamun, Egypt. Tutankhamun was never supposed to be famous. He wasn't the most powerful, or the longest reigning, or even particularly remembered by his own people. He ruled for less than a decade, died around the age of 19, and left behind no grand legacy of conquests or monuments. In fact, for over 3,000 years, he was almost completely forgotten. A footnote in the tomb registries, a king whose name was barely whispered past the walls of antiquity. And then in 1922, his corpse got upgraded. When Howard Carter cracked open the boy pharaoh's tomb, what he found wasn't just treasure. He found a mystery, a sealed chamber so intact, so glittering, so aggressively over-decorated that it broke the centuries' collective imagination. Gold coffins, jeweled daggers, sacred amulets, weirdly well-preserved food, but also a skeleton, small, delicate, shriveled from time and ritual. Barely 5'6", about 168 centimeters in life. The most famous pharaoh in modern memory was short, not laughably short, just enough to make the gods nervous. And here's where it gets complicated, because Tutankhamun wasn't just short, he was frail. CT scans and genetic studies in the 2000s revealed a litany of issues: cleft palate, club foot, a deformed spine, necrosis in the toes. He likely walked with a cane and may have suffered from malaria. His left foot was twisted, his bones were porous. Some researchers even think he needed assistance to stand for long periods, which throws a wrench into the traditional idea of pharaonic power, those grand statues of perfect symmetry, those eternal carvings of wide-shouldered gods, those images of immortal strength and divine lineage. Tutankhamun's body was not built for battle. It wasn't even built for walking around the palace courtyard without tripping over itself. And yet, the royal iconography lied with a straight face. In paintings, he stands tall and heroic, smiting enemies with a single hand. His golden mask is majestic, impassive, regal, nothing like the skull beneath it. The entire mythology of his image is built on contradiction. A boy whose body betrayed him, encased in symbols of invincibility. That's the irony of Tutankhamun. His fame is posthumous, his power was symbolic, and his body, well, it was a bureaucratic embarrassment. Some scholars believe he wasn't even meant to be buried in that now famous tomb. The chamber is unusually small for a king. The wall paintings were rushed. Some of the artifacts may have originally belonged to someone else, possibly a queen. It was as if the state wanted to get him buried quickly and move on. No fanfare, no divine ceremony. Just shuffle the short pharaoh into the afterlife and hope no one notices. But people did notice. Thousands of years later, the world rediscovered him and then started projecting. Suddenly, Tutankhamun became a symbol of ancient glory, a pin-up pharaoh for museums and documentaries. His image was blown up on posters, t-shirts, and refrigerator magnets. He became the most traveled corpse in modern history, going on international tours like a headlining celebrity. The fact that his life was short and possibly miserable, irrelevant. He looked good in gold. And maybe that's the strangest part of all. The global fascination wasn't with the man, it was with the illusion. The trappings of grandeur wrapped around a teenage frame. A boy buried in more gold than most dynasties ever see, even though his actual reign was mostly paperwork and restoration. He didn't build empires. He undid his predecessors' theological experiments. He wasn't a revolutionary. He was a reset button. His biggest political move was returning the capital to Thebes and pretending everything was normal. So, what do we make of him now? A small king, in both stature and historical footprint, made large only by accident. If Howard Carter's lantern had flickered in the wrong direction, if looters had arrived first, if a sandstorm had covered the tomb for another century, no one would remember his name. But instead, he got lucky in death, and unlucky in life, which, if you think about it, is the exact reverse of most kings. There's something unsettling about that reversal. How history elevates those who were sidelined and forgets those who once stood tallest. How a small, sickly teenager becomes the poster child for divine Egyptian royalty, How a boy who probably limped through life is now walked past by millions behind glass in silence. And from one diminutive monarch who was elevated after death, we turn now to one who was very much alive and very short when he ruled modern Europe. A man so obsessed with optics, he built his image around tanks and medals. But the tape measure tells another story. Just over 5 feet, dressed in royal uniform, armed with ceremonial swords longer than his inseam. Victor Emmanuel III never stood tall, but somehow he still cast shadows. Victor Emmanuel III, Italy. In official photographs, Victor Emmanuel III looks like a prop. He's often positioned just left of centre, flanked by generals twice his width and fascist officials half his age. His uniform is starched, his medals plentiful, and his chin just barely clears the breastplate. The only thing royal about him is the title, and even that feels like an afterthought. Italy's king from 1900 to 1946, ruler through 2 world wars and multiple regime changes, Victor Emmanuel III stood at around 153 centimeters, just over 5 feet tall. That's less than your average Italian schoolboy. And yet he was king. A monarch by blood, but also by bureaucratic inertia. When his father, Umberto I, was assassinated in 1900, Victor Emmanuel inherited the crown like a poorly tailored jacket, ill-fitting and heavy. He wasn't built for grandeur. He was built for compromise. Italy didn't exactly cheer when he took the throne. His reign began in caution and seemed permanently stuck there. Foreign diplomats were surprised by how small he was. One British envoy remarked that His Majesty might pass unchallenged through the servants' entrance at Buckingham. Even his moustache had to work overtime to add gravitas. But size wasn't just a visual detail, it was a liability. Royal audiences, military reviews, state visits, all presented opportunities for comparison, and comparison rarely worked in his favour. Still, Victor Emmanuel understood the optics. He compensated in ways both classic and bizarre. He insisted on military uniforms so heavy with decoration they looked like armour. He surrounded himself with taller guards and taller furniture. He commissioned statues that, for once, didn't reflect his exact dimensions. In bronze and marble, he finally looked like a king. In reality, he could barely see over a podium. But here's the unsettling part. His smallness made him more dangerous, not less. Unlike the towering autocrats of his era, Victor Emmanuel didn't rule by charisma or force. He ruled by absence. He let others do the shouting while he signed the decrees. He avoided confrontation but enabled catastrophe. In short, he was the kind of monarch history barely notices until it's too late. During World War I, he tried to play the symbolic figurehead. He visited troops, inspected trenches, offered medals. And in fairness, soldiers seemed to like him. He was non-threatening, modest, a grandfatherly figure who didn't tower over them, but symbolism only gets you so far. After the war, Italy spiraled into economic collapse, political chaos, and social unrest. And then, of course, the fascists came marching. In 1922, when Benito Mussolini led the infamous March on Rome, most expected Victor Emmanuel to call in the army, declare martial law, and shut it down. He didn't. Instead, he handed Mussolini the keys to the kingdom. Just like that. No speeches, no firm stands, no throne room drama. Just quiet acquiescence. Why? Historians still argue. Some say he feared civil war. Others say he sympathized with the fascists. But one theory lurks under the surface never quite said out loud, that he simply didn't have the presence to command resistance, that his size, both physically and politically, made him easy to ignore. He wasn't a wall. He was a hallway. Power didn't stop with him, it passed through. Under Mussolini's regime, Victor Emmanuel faded further into the background. He became a decorative monarch. His signature appeared on anti-Semitic laws, on declarations of war, on political purges. And still, he said nothing. History would like to believe he was just too small to stop it all. But silence, too, is a decision, especially when it's coming from a throne. When World War II ended and Italy's monarchy faced judgment, Victor Emmanuel tried one last disappearing act. He abdicated in favor of his son, hoping a fresh face would save the crown. It didn't. In 1946, Italy voted to abolish the monarchy entirely. The royal family was exiled. Victor Emmanuel fled to Egypt, where he lived the rest of his life in quiet irrelevance, occasionally seen walking his dog, looking like a retired shopkeeper rather than a deposed king. He died in 1947 in Alexandria, far from the marble palaces and bronze statues built in his name. His body was buried in a Catholic church next to a tram stop. No state funeral, no crowd. Just a 5-foot monarch buried in the shadows of his own history. And that's the mystery of Victor Emmanuel III, how someone so small could oversee something so massive without ever really being seen. A king who watched his country collapse from beneath a stack of medals and silence. Next, we return to the 17th century and to a queen who defied both her era and her gender by ruling as a philosopher king in a court of sycophants and doing it all from barely 5 feet tall. Christina of Sweden was not just short, she was disruptive, and Europe wasn't ready for her. Christina, Queen of Sweden. Christina of Sweden wasn't short because the world made her feel small. She was short because the world simply wasn't built to contain her. Measuring in at around 150 to 152 centimeters, she stood just under 5 feet tall. But she filled rooms the way a lightning storm fills a cathedral. Erratic, dazzling, and a little dangerous to stand near. She was born in 1626. Daughter of Gustavus Adolphus, the warrior king who made Sweden a Protestant powerhouse during the 30 Years' War. From birth, Christina was treated more like a political hypothesis than a child. She was groomed not just to rule but to replace a man. Her father died in battle when she was 6. The country needed a monarch, and the only one available was a girl who was short, sharp, and weirdly self-possessed. At her coronation, she wore trousers under her gown, not as a statement, but as a preference. From an early age, Christina made it clear she would not perform royalty the way anyone expected. She didn't smile sweetly, or marry advantageously, or daintily lower herself into chairs. She scowled. She read Descartes. She quoted Seneca. She conducted political debates at 12 and refused marriage proposals at 22. And still, she ruled. But the thing that most confused her contemporaries, besides her refusal to be feminine in any recognizable way, was her sheer presence. She was short, yes, but never small. Visitors described her voice as loud and piercing, her movements as restless and impatient, her attention as frighteningly focused. She didn't walk into a room so much as rearrange its gravity. And she hated court life. She once called it a menagerie of masks and empty words. She preferred the company of philosophers, scientists, theologians, the kinds of people who didn't care whether you were 5 feet tall or 6, as long as you could quote Cicero without stammering. She brought René Descartes to Stockholm, where he promptly died of pneumonia, possibly from the unheated castle she made him visit at dawn. She wanted to talk metaphysics before breakfast. He wanted to not freeze to death. The compromise did not go well. Christina's height, like everything else about her, became a kind of riddle. She dressed in masculine clothing, wore her hair short, and reportedly walked with a swagger that confused ambassadors. Foreign dignitaries whispered that she was unnaturally small for a monarch, but also oddly magnetic. Some said she looked like a young boy in royal drag. Others said she was striking in her ugliness. The descriptions often said more about the viewer than the queen. What unsettled them wasn't just her stature, it was the fact that she didn't apologize for it. She didn't add height with fashion or posture or heels. She didn't soften her voice or her words. She didn't try to seduce. She tried to dominate, and not with charm, but with ideas. In 1654, after 10 years on the throne, Christina did something truly unprecedented. She abdicated, just gave it up, packed her things, handed the crown to her cousin, and left Sweden entirely. She said the burden of rule was too great. Some said it was because she wanted to convert to Catholicism, which she did. Others said she was simply tired of pretending to care about politics, and some, quietly, said she just didn't like being told what to do. She moved to Rome, where she lived out her days as a philosophical curiosity, a queen without a country, a monarch in exile by choice. She started salons, hosted poets, consulted with popes. She became a patron of the arts, a collector of ancient manuscripts, and a fixture in Roman intellectual circles. The locals didn't know what to make of her. She was a Lutheran-turned-Catholic ex-queen who dressed like a man and refused to marry. She carried herself like someone twice her size and 3 times her budget. Christina never married, never had children, and never returned to the throne. She once said that she had been born too free for this world. Maybe she was right. The world tried to hand her crowns and corsets, and she flung both into the fire. When she died in 1689, she was buried in St. Peter's Basilica, a rare honor for a woman, let alone a former Protestant monarch. And yet, like so much else about her life, the final resting place felt oddly mismatched to the person it held. An eternal home for a woman who never stood still. So what do we make of Christina? A ruler too short for her throne and too tall for her time? A monarch who renounced monarchy? A queen who made philosophers kneel but wouldn't bow to expectations? And now we pass from one French-speaking enigma to another. A man who inherited the name Napoleon, but never quite the legacy. He ruled, briefly, between a rock and an uprising. Slight in stature, cautious in vision, and destined to be remembered as both echo and epilogue. Napoleon III stood at 166 centimeters, and somehow even that felt like borrowed height. Napoleon III, France. He was the nephew of a legend and the echo of an empire. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, later styled as Napoleon III, stood at approximately 166 centimeters, or about 5 feet 5 inches. Not scandalously short, not quite as mocked as his uncle, but still compact enough to be looked down on by most of the military men he loved to dress like. He wore the name Napoleon like a borrowed costume, one a little too big in the shoulders. And yet, through a baffling combination of timing, charm, opportunism, and sheer Bonapartist branding, he managed to carve out a throne from the wreckage of post-revolutionary France, twice. He didn't start as a serious contender. Born in 1808, during the First Empire's heyday, Louis Napoleon spent most of his early life in exile. While his more celebrated uncle was etched into the annals of military legend, Napoleon III was busy writing pamphlets about social reform, dabbling in utopianism, and getting kicked out of various European countries for attempting half-hearted coups. If Napoleon I was the embodiment of explosive ambition, Napoleon III was more like a gentle leak in the same direction. But ambition has its own shapes. and Napoleon III's came not through the cannon but through the ballot box. In 1848, during one of France's regularly scheduled political implosions, Louis Napoleon was elected president of the Second Republic in a landslide. Not because people knew what he stood for, but because they recognized the name. The Bonaparte myth still glittered even as its new bearer stood a few centimeters below the national average. Physically, he was a mix of contradictions, short but slow-moving, broad-shouldered but soft-spoken. His eyes, according to observers, were tired and slightly melancholy, like he was perpetually two thoughts behind the conversation, but he made up for it with presence. He understood the camera before the camera existed. Portraits of him often show a man trying to look taller, chin lifted just enough to suggest perspective, boots polished to a distracting shine, and always that signature mustache, curled with mathematical precision, a sort of punctuation mark for a sentence that never quite landed. In 1852, he pulled a very Bonapartist move. He staged a coup and declared himself emperor. The Second French Empire was born not with a roar, but with a shrug and some scattered applause. And thus began one of the strangest imperial reigns in European history, led by a man who looked like a museum docent, dressed like a field marshal, and governed like a middle manager, trying very hard to seem decisive. His critics mocked him as Napoleon the Small, not just for his height, but for the idea that he lacked his uncle's brilliance, boldness, and battlefield swagger. Victor Hugo famously tore into him in pamphlets, portraying him as a fraud wrapped in velvet. Others were kinder, or at least more confused. Napoleon III was capable, but not inspiring. Visionary, but inconsistent. A dreamer, but only before lunch. And yet, for all his modest frame and even more modest charisma, he left a surprisingly large footprint. He modernized Paris, hired Baron Haussmann to bulldoze the medieval alleyways and install wide boulevards designed both for beauty and for military control. He expanded the railways, supported public education, and attempted to forge a version of empire that was less bloodthirsty and more bureaucratic. It didn't always work, but it was ambitious in its own quietly nervous way. His foreign policy, however, eventually tripped him. The Mexican adventure, an ill-advised attempt to install a European emperor in Latin America, was a debacle. And his decision to go to war with Prussia in 1870 was, in hindsight, an act of overcompensation. He wanted to prove himself. He ended up captured. At the Battle of Sedan, surrounded and outmaneuvered, Napoleon III surrendered. The image of an emperor, short, tired, mustachioed, handing over his sword to the Prussians, became a visual punchline across Europe. The Second Empire collapsed overnight. Paris rose in revolt. Napoleon III went into exile in England, where he would spend the last few years of his life wandering around gardens, trying to stay relevant to newspapers that had already moved on. He died in 1873, quietly, without ceremony, and unlike his uncle, there was no myth waiting to absorb him, no street Helena, no red-caped oil paintings, no debates about greatness versus tyranny, just a short emperor who dreamed big, acted cautiously, and lost cleanly. What's fascinating is how easily he's forgotten. He was the last monarch to rule France, the man who rebuilt Paris, a king in everything but legacy. But history remembers the mustache, not the mind. The name, not the nuance. And so, from one man who inherited an empire too heavy for his frame, we move to another who never quite reached eye level with his dynasty literally. Kim Jong-il, the dear leader of North Korea, was known for many things: cults of personality, nuclear ambitions, and gravity-defying hair. But behind the elevator shoes and theatrical lighting was a ruler standing at just 165 centimeters and an even taller myth to maintain. Kim Jong-il, North Korea. Officially, Kim Jong-il didn't have a height. Not really. The North Korean state never confirmed it. Measurements weren't included in the biographies. And if you tried to ask, you were either ignored or swiftly re-educated in the fine art of not asking. But unofficially, through eyewitness accounts, defectors' testimonies, leaked medical reports, and the occasional intelligence estimate his height lands somewhere around 165 centimeters, or roughly 5 feet 5 inches. What made that height notable wasn't the number. It was the effort made to conceal it. You could say Kim Jong-il's entire reign was a grand illusion of scale. From the towering bronze statues of his father, to the massive parades of perfectly synchronized soldiers, to the surreal architecture of Pyongyang's empty skyline, it was all about appearing larger than life. And Kim, personally, was not. So he compensated extensively. He wore platform shoes, sometimes with insoles stacked high enough to qualify as climbing gear. He had bouffant hair sculpted to add vertical volume, resulting in a silhouette that could only be described as pyramid chic. His tailors cut jackets with padded shoulders and elongated torsos. His bodyguards were reportedly selected not just for loyalty, but for being shorter than him, a strategy with ancient roots and modern absurdity. Because if you can't grow taller, you shrink the room. And yet, in private photos and unretouched video, the illusion occasionally cracked. Next to foreign dignitaries, Kim looked like what he was, a compact man surrounded by oversized spectacle. Still, he never allowed that to define him. Because he understood something vital about power, something every ruler on this list seemed to grasp instinctively. Size is performative. It's not the body that matters. It's the myth around it. And Kim Jong-il was nothing if not a myth builder. He inherited the role of supreme leader in 1994 after the death of his father, Kim Il-sung, the eternal president of North Korea, still technically head of state decades after his passing. That alone tells you how Kim Jong-il viewed time and legacy as flexible constructs. He ruled not just with ideology, but with narrative. His state-controlled biography claimed he was born on Mount Paektu under a double rainbow, accompanied by the spontaneous blooming of flowers and a new star appearing in the sky. In reality, he was born in the Soviet Union, but reality was not welcome in Pyongyang. Kim's entire persona was a contradiction factory. He was short, but demanded reverence. Awkward in public, yet projected as charismatic. Quiet, but feared. He didn't speak often on camera, didn't give lengthy speeches, didn't bellow in parades like other strongmen. His power came from stillness. He was the absence that filled the room. The silence you didn't dare interrupt. And yet, beneath the fear and propaganda, there's the strange figure of a man obsessed with cinema. A genuine cinephile who collected thousands of foreign films. A man who once kidnapped a South Korean director and actress to forcibly create a North Korean film industry. A man who reportedly loved Elizabeth Taylor movies and James Bond films, but censored his entire country from knowing either existed. His vision for North Korea was part Marxist stage play, part personal movie set, and he always cast himself as the director. Even the country's militarism had theatrical flair. Massive parades, giant slogans, choreographed tears, a constant performance designed to make everything feel bigger, louder, more grandiose. All while the man at the center remained suspiciously shorter than most of his generals. But what makes Kim Jong-il's height so interesting isn't just that it was carefully managed, it's that it mattered. In a country where every detail of reality was state-curated, his size was a problem that had to be solved, not biologically, narratively. Western media, of course, didn't help. The caricatures were predictable. A tiny dictator with big weapons, an insecure man compensating through nuclear posturing. It's a trope as old as time, tyranny in a small package. But the truth, as always, is more complicated. Kim wasn't just short. He was sharp, strategic, calculating. He kept a crumbling, starving, diplomatically isolated country functioning barely, but functionally for nearly 2 decades. That requires more than delusion. That requires control. And control doesn't need height. When Kim Jong-il died in 2011, the state fell into orchestrated mourning. People wailed in the streets. Entire avenues shut down. The news footage, beamed to the world, showed tens of thousands of people grieving a man they barely knew but knew they should fear. And above it all, his statue taller than reality ever allowed was unveiled in bronze. Immense, immobile, eternal. It towered over the crowds like a judgment. And yet, for all the scale, the image still couldn't hide the truth. The man himself had always been small, meticulously managed, quietly insecure, a product of illusion. From the ghostly myth of one carefully staged legacy, we descend now into even deeper irony. Louis XIV, the Sun King, was said to embody grandeur, majesty, divine right. But without his heels, he was barely taller than his violinist. And no amount of sunlight could cast a shadow longer than 5 feet 4 inches. To Louis XIV, he was called the Sun King, the radiant center of the French universe. A monarch whose name still glows in the gold leaf of Versailles, whose every breath was translated into ritual, whose presence redefined majesty itself. But Louis XIV Le Roi Soleil stood at around 163 centimeters, or roughly 5 feet 4 inches, and that's being generous. That number doesn't include the heels, and Louis never went without heels. In fact, Louis XIV didn't just wear high heels, he institutionalized them. His personal footwear often sported heels of 2 to 4 inches, dyed blood red and embellished with embroidery. In his court, red heels became a badge of status, but only he could wear them at their highest. The shorter he was, the taller the court was required to pretend he was. And so, like many things in absolutist France, it wasn't just fashion. It was propaganda. Let's be clear, Louis XIV wasn't short in the peasant sense. He wasn't a village curiosity or a court jester-sized monarch. He was slightly below average for a Frenchman of his time. But slightly below average doesn't cut it when you're trying to convince an entire continent that you were appointed by God himself. So, he made himself taller, in heels, on stages, through mirrors, through architecture, through ritual. Every day of his life was a performance designed to compensate for something he never acknowledged. His mornings began with Le Grand Lever, the Great Waking, an elaborate choreographed event in which nobles were granted permission to watch the king get out of bed, dress, and bathe. The further down the noble food chain you were, the later you were allowed in the room. It wasn't hygiene, it was hierarchy. At the center of this sun-worshipping spectacle stood a man barely taller than his valet, lifted by inches of carved leather, surrounded by people pretending not to notice. Louis understood that power was perception. Versailles itself was an optical illusion, a palace that turned small men into gods and gods into furniture. Its halls were wide, its ceilings vaulted, its mirrors multiplying every gesture into infinity. Louis made himself omnipresent not by growing, but by reflecting. He knew how to manipulate scale, not just in shoes, but in politics. He shrank his nobles socially by forcing them to compete for meaningless privileges. He reduced the power of the aristocracy not through executions, but through etiquette. Want to be powerful? Then master the fork. Want access to the king? Better know which sleeve to kiss and when. It was domination by choreography. And in that theatre of dominance, Louis XIV always played the lead. Every portrait made him taller. Every bust exaggerated his posture. In paintings, he's often depicted standing with one leg slightly forward, a pose designed to lengthen the figure, suggest movement, and disguise scale. The sword at his side, often longer than his inseam. The throne, oversized by design. But behind the velvet, the rituals, the dramatic lighting, stood a man constantly managing his own image. His physical reality, a 5'4" monarch with a receding hairline and an aging spine, had to be overruled by spectacle. Every inch he lacked in stature was fabricated through repetition. Even his military campaigns bore this same signature. Louis liked to be seen as a warrior king, a general in the field, but in truth, he rarely rode into battle. He preferred the symbolism of command to the mud of the trenches. He'd visit the front in ceremonial armor, pose for the painters, then retreat to the safety of his tent. His generals did the real fighting. His image did the conquering. And yet, despite all the artifice he worked, Louis XIV ruled France for over 72 years, the longest reign of any major European monarch. Under his command, France became the cultural and political center of Europe. Art, fashion, architecture, dance, all bent to his orbit. Even his death was orchestrated. As he lay dying, he reportedly told his heir, "Do not imitate me in the taste I have had for building. Take care to relieve the people's burden." A rare moment of humility from a man whose entire life had been one continuous construction project. But humility didn't last. After his death, the Sun King was buried in a simple coffin, no gold, no velvet, no towering structure, just a body, in the ground, that didn't measure up to the myth. Today, visitors still walk the endless marble halls of Versailles. They stare at the statues, the gilded moldings, the portraits of a king taller than history ever recorded him. And few ask how tall he really was, because in the end, the illusion stuck. But illusions don't end at French borders. A few centuries later, another queen would take the stage, also short, also steely, and also relentlessly engineered to project height through presence. She ruled not from a palace of mirrors, but from Buckingham, with corgis at her feet and half the planet in her dominion. Queen Elizabeth II may have stood only 163 centimeters, but her reign loomed for 7 decades. Queen Elizabeth II, United Kingdom. For most of her reign, Queen Elizabeth II stood at about 163 centimeters, around 5 feet 4 inches. Not tall, not short, simply present. That was her great power. After all, not spectacle, not charisma, but a kind of disciplined omnipresence. She wasn't meant to tower. She was meant to endure. And endure she did, quietly outlasting empires, presidents, prime ministers, and entire political ideologies with the mild but unmistakable energy of someone whose height you never question because you're too busy curtsying. Her physical size rarely came up, not because it wasn't noticeable. She was routinely the smallest person in any official photograph, but because her image had been so tightly stage managed that it didn't need height. She didn't need to loom. She didn't even need to raise her voice. She was the kind of monarch who could silence a room with a glance and reset global attention with a single broach choice. Subtle, surgical, strategic. She ascended the throne in 1952 at just 25 years old, already on the shorter side of monarchy, already expected to carry the full weight of a post-war Commonwealth and to do it with grace, restraint, and precisely measured hats. What followed was not a reign of grandeur, but of gravity. She did not grow larger with time. The world simply bent more quietly around her. And yet, those who met her in person were often struck by her smallness, not in the metaphorical sense, but the literal one. She was famously petite, slender, straight-backed, with a gait so carefully calibrated it bordered on choreography. When she entered a room, she didn't command it by filling it. She didn't dominate space like some towering autocrat. Instead, she rearranged its atmosphere. People didn't look at her, they looked to her. Much of her physical stature was cloaked in uniform, the vibrant coats, the matching hats, the gloves, the purses, always in hand, all carefully calculated to increase visibility. The Queen had to be seen to be believed, and the clothing did the scaling. Her stylists even described choosing colours not for fashion but for optics: lemon yellow, cobalt blue, magenta. She became a walking highlighter, small in frame, unmissable in function. And that's what made her so uniquely difficult to satirize. You could mimic the voice, you could parody the wave. But the shape of Queen Elizabeth, the physical visual shorthand for stability, was not something easily exaggerated. She was already playing at the edge of visibility. A monarch who felt vast in concept and modest in form. Someone who could shrink herself into ritual while still expanding across postage stamps and passports. Of course, she didn't start small. As a young woman, she had a sturdier frame, a more athletic bearing. But time and decades of public duty have a way of compressing even the most durable people. In later years, as is the case with many elderly individuals, her stature physically diminished. Some reports suggest she measured closer to 5'2" by her final public appearances. She moved slower, sat more, spoke less. But the symbolism didn't shrink with her. If anything, it intensified. Every appearance became more mythic, every gesture more symbolic. A small figure wrapped in monochrome, shaking hands with presidents whose knees probably hurt from bowing. Her size, if noticed at all, only enhanced the contrast. She didn't need to be tall. She had outlasted tallness. She had outlived grandeur. And yet, this quiet contradiction persisted. She was both human and emblem, both tiny and towering. A woman who, by her own design, never tried to rise above the institution, but somehow rose above history itself. The Queen who never made headlines but outlived the news cycle. A monarch whose power lay in not having to prove it. And through it all, she kept her decorum. That impenetrable exterior, that smile that was either vaguely amused or slightly disapproving, but never clarifying which. She was not warm. She was not cold. She was weather. The kind of leader who would shake your hand politely while knowing exactly how many diplomatic cables you'd leaked. Her small stature made her more relatable in some ways, but only theoretically. The average person could imagine standing next to her, maybe even looking her in the eye. But emotionally, politically, spiritually, she was unreachable. A monarch in miniature scale, cast in titanium. And when she died in 2022, the contrast became even sharper. The rituals surrounding her, passing the processions, the mourning, the endless commentary were all supersized. The Queen herself had shrunk, almost literally, before our eyes. And yet, somehow, she still occupied more space than anyone else on the planet. So, what do we make of Queen Elizabeth II? A small figure in big shoes? Or someone who quietly proved that stature isn't measured in centimeters, but in continuity? That the ability to remain through decades of dysfunction, decolonization, disaster, and dogs might be a more radical kind of dominance than height ever was? And from a monarch who reigned by remaining still, we now turn to one who never stopped moving. A military genius so revered, his enemies feared his strategy, even in absence. But by most estimates, he never stood taller than 160 centimeters. Frederick the Great wasn't large. He just thought big and fought bigger. Frederick the Great, Prussia. Frederick the Great, King of Prussia, stood at around 160 centimeters, roughly 5 feet 3 inches. And that wasn't the only thing that made him look out of place among the rowdy, saber-rattling monarchs of 18th century Europe. He was a man of paradoxes, a military genius who preferred flutes to muskets, a philosopher king who read Voltaire and rewrote military theory, a short man in a tall hat who transformed a patchwork of cold farmland into a feared European power. He didn't look like a conqueror. He wasn't built like one either. But when your brain is faster than your cavalry and your map is tighter than your trousers, you don't need to be tall, you just need to be accurate. And Frederick was nothing if not precise. He was born in 1712 into the House of Hohenzollern under the shadow of a father who was, in almost every possible way, his opposite. Frederick William I was a tall, violent man obsessed with the military and deeply allergic to books, music, or anything resembling softness. He referred to his son as effeminate and once said, with paternal charm, that he wished the boy had been stillborn. Frederick, in contrast, loved literature, philosophy, and the arts. He was short, thin, and refined and learned early that in his father's world, all of those were liabilities. So, he adapted. Frederick spent his adolescence toggling between two modes, one for public display and one for private survival. Publicly, he became the dutiful son. Privately, he wrote letters to Voltaire. Publicly, he wore the uniform. Privately, he composed sonatas. He was a boy forced to act tall in a court that measured everything in inches and scars. But survival taught him something crucial. Power doesn't need to look like power, it just needs to work. When his father died in 1740, Frederick inherited a kingdom known more for potatoes than military prestige. It was underfunded, under-respected, and surrounded by powers that assumed Prussia would remain politely small. But within weeks of taking the throne, Frederick launched a military campaign to seize Silesia from Austria, beginning the War of Austrian Succession and shocking the continent. It worked. Repeatedly. Frederick wasn't just a military man, he was a tactician. He moved troops like chess pieces and conducted battle like chamber music. He was small, but his battlefield vision was panoramic. Under his reign, Prussia fought with an agility that bigger armies couldn't match. He called it oblique order, a strategy that allowed him to hit the enemy at angles they couldn't anticipate. He didn't just punch, he sidestepped, ducked, redirected, and then hit you from the flank. Sound familiar? He wasn't charismatic in the conventional sense. His voice was thin, his posture tense, and his expressions often veered into the icy or sardonic. But his soldiers respected him because he shared their hardships. He marched with them, slept in tents, ate their food. He was short, yes, but also omnipresent, not above them, among them. And yet, for all his military genius, Frederick remained oddly insecure. He built Sanssouci, his summer palace, not as a symbol of royal excess, but as a private retreat where he could think, read, and escape the noise of kingship. He filled it with books and sculptures, not courtiers. It was scaled to his preferences, not to impress foreign dignitaries, which is, in itself, a kind of defiance. Despite his battlefield brilliance, Frederick never married, never produced an heir, and never seemed particularly interested in continuing the lineage. He wrote poetry, he translated classical texts. He argued with Enlightenment thinkers and criticized organized religion. He once declared that a crown is merely a hat that lets the rain in. This from a man who wore one for 46 years. His portraits, however, tried to elevate him, literally. They often show him standing on rocky outcrops or behind parapets, looking down at a battlefield or over a realm that didn't quite match his height. But again, that was the trick. Height didn't matter if your legacy outlived you. When Frederick died in 1786, he left behind a kingdom transformed, an army feared, a state admired, and a reputation that still echoes in military academies centuries later. He was buried beside his dogs, by request. No gilded tomb, no towering mausoleum. Just a man, a garden, and a stone. In the end, he may have stood 5 feet 3 inches, but he ruled like someone 10 times that tall. Because sometimes, the smallest person in the room is also the most dangerous. Not because they threaten you physically, but because they've already thought 4 moves ahead. And speaking of royal contradictions, our next story moves us eastward. To a boy king born in a collapsing empire, dressed in silks, worshipped like a god, and imprisoned in his own palace by the time he hit puberty. Puyi, the last emperor of China, was said to stand around 163 centimeters, but even that felt generous next to the towering shadows of dynasties gone by. Puyi, Xuantong Emperor Qing Chine. In the final photograph of Puyi as Emperor of China, a child dressed in ornate dragon robes, perched atop a carved throne too large for his frame. He looks almost like a doll. His feet don't touch the floor. His hands are tucked obediently in his lap. Behind him, the crumbling bones of the Qing dynasty creak beneath centuries of imperial ritual, silk and dust. And there he sits, Puyi, age 2. Future ghost of an empire, standing, eventually at approximately 163 centimeters tall, 5 feet 4 inches, more or less. He would be remembered, if at all, as the last emperor, but he was also among the smallest, physically, politically, emotionally trapped inside a machine that had been running long before he was born and which no longer remembered how to stop. When he was declared emperor in 1908, Puyi was still in diapers, chosen for succession not because of any particular talent. He could barely form a sentence, but because the dying Guangxu emperor had no heir. In typical imperial fashion, the solution was bureaucratic. Pluck the nearest available child with a suitable bloodline and declare him the son of heaven. Problem solved. Except the heavens had already moved on. By 1911, the Xinhai Revolution brought down the 2,000-year-old imperial system, and Puyi, the little emperor, was suddenly not. Officially, the monarchy was abolished. Unofficially, Puyi was allowed to remain inside the Forbidden City, the sprawling imperial compound in the heart of Beijing, where he lived like a monarch in exile who hadn't technically left yet. He was a child surrounded by adults, pretending nothing had changed. Inside the city walls, the rituals continued. Servants still bowed, court eunuchs still scurried, and Puyi still conducted imaginary governance over a country that no longer existed. But outside the gates, China was moving on. Republics rose, warlords feuded, ideologies bloomed and died, but within the Forbidden City, time stood still. And so did Puyi, a short boy on a tall throne, trapped in ceremonial amber. He was the last to wear the dragon robe, the last to be worshipped as semi-divine, The last to perform the tea ceremony in front of empty chairs meant to represent his ancestors. It wasn't power, it was performance. And he played the role the only way he knew how, with blank eyes and quiet confusion. By the time he was expelled from the palace in 1924, Puyi was 18, still short, still delicate in build, still inexperienced in the world beyond his own echo chamber. When he stepped outside the Forbidden City gates for the first time, it wasn't liberation, it was cultural whiplash. Cars honked, newspapers printed his name without reverence. People walked past him without kneeling. He was no longer an emperor, he was a problem. And yet, Puyi couldn't let go of the illusion. He tried to claw his way back to power not through swords or armies, but through foreign alliances. In the 1930 seconds, the Japanese, eager to expand their hold over China, installed him as a puppet ruler in Manchukuo, the occupied territory they declared a new imperial state. Once again, Puyi found himself seated on a throne that didn't belong to him. He wore the robes, recited the rituals, signed decrees, all dictated by someone else. They called him emperor, but he was a mascot, a figurehead used to provide the thin illusion of legitimacy. He was guarded, manipulated, surveilled. His meals were pre-selected. His words were scripted. His every movement choreographed to serve a power he didn't understand and couldn't resist. His stature, already unassuming, was made smaller by the towering spectacle around him. Giant banners, tall Japanese generals, massive portraits, and relentless propaganda all served to remind everyone, including him, who was really in charge. The Manchukuo court was an opera without music, and Puyi was the prop that kept forgetting its lines. After World War II, Puyi was captured by the Soviet Union, then returned to China to stand trial for collaboration. And for once, he wasn't protected by regalia or ritual. He was 5'4" in a prison jumpsuit, confessing his crimes before Communist Party officials with expressions carved from granite. He was no longer the son of heaven, just a man who'd spent his life cosplaying a god. But this isn't a story of total downfall. In one of history's stranger second acts, Puyi was later re-educated and allowed to live as a civilian under the People's Republic. He became a gardener, literally. He trimmed hedges in Beijing and worked at a botanical institute. He married a factory worker, rode the bus, lined up for rice. The last emperor of China, queuing politely for dumplings. He died in 1967. No grand funeral, no marble tomb. Just a man who had once worn a robe sewn with dragons, now buried in a government plot with bureaucratic precision. Puyi's life is not just a tragedy of lost power, it's a study in scale. He was never tall, but the systems around him were. Too tall to escape, too elaborate to fight, and too brittle to survive. From the last emperor of China to one of the last emperors of Ethiopia, we travel next to a man who stood even shorter, just 157 centimeters, but whose global legacy towers in memory. Haile Selassie, I Lion of Judah, prophet to millions, and yet another ruler who proved that stature has nothing to do with height and everything to do with myth. Haile Selassie, doubly Ethiopia. Haile Selassie. I stood just 157 centimeters tall, roughly 5 feet 2 inches. He was, quite literally, a small man in a big cloak. But what he lacked in height, he made up for in symbolic weight. To many, he wasn't just an emperor. He was divine. The 225th monarch in a line said to descend from King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. The conquering lion of the tribe of Judah. His throne wasn't merely political, it was metaphysical. And yet, there was something undeniably fragile about him. slender frame, narrow shoulders, deep, cautious eyes. His voice, when recorded, was soft, deliberate, and a little higher than you'd expect. But he spoke with gravity, not volume. He ruled a country of dramatic geography and even more dramatic politics. And he ruled it for over 4 decades, across revolutions, invasions, and decolonization, all while barely reaching the shoulder line of the soldiers he commanded. Born Tafari Makonnen in 1892, he began his political career in the shadows, observing, calculating, and quietly moving up the ranks of Ethiopia's complicated feudal aristocracy. When he was crowned emperor in 1930, he took the name Haile Selassie, meaning power of the Trinity. He also took several other things: the attention of the world, the loyalty of a vast and ancient kingdom, and, most curiously, the theological fascination of a Jamaican religious movement that would one day call him the Messiah. But before we get to the spiritual stuff, let's talk about politics and scale. In photographs, Haile Selassie is often seen standing next to global giants: Roosevelt, Churchill, Kennedy, even the towering Charles de Gaulle. He looks like a child emperor lost at a diplomatic summer camp. But he never looks intimidated. His posture is ramrod straight, his expression unreadable. If he noticed the height difference, he never showed it. And more importantly, neither did they. There was a quiet force in his presence, something that made taller men lean in. And in moments of crisis, that force took center stage. In 1935, Mussolini's fascist Italy invaded Ethiopia. It was one of the last remaining independent nations in Africa. The world watched, mostly unmoved. Ethiopia, after all, was small, poor, pre-modern. But Selassie wasn't interested in playing the victim. He took his case directly to the League of Nations, standing before the Assembly in Geneva, wearing his imperial robes and delivering a speech in French that would echo for decades. He said, "It is us today. It will be you tomorrow." His voice was calm, but the subtext was volcanic. He accused the world of cowardice, hypocrisy, and moral failure. And while the League ultimately did nothing, Selassie's speech marked a turning point. He became a symbol not just of Ethiopia, but of anti-colonial resistance, a short emperor who stood taller than a room full of bureaucrats. After 5 years in exile, he returned to Ethiopia in 1941, helped by British forces. His image on horseback, riding back into a liberated Addis Ababa, was straight out of mythology, and he didn't waste it. He used his second reign to modernize the country, slowly, centralize power, efficiently, and cultivate international relationships with a range of contradictory partners: Western democracies, African socialist states, and the newly formed United Nations. But outside of politics, another legend was taking shape, one even larger than the imperial myth. On the other side of the world, in the streets of Jamaica, a religious movement was forming. Inspired by his coronation and drawing on biblical prophecy, a group of spiritual visionaries declared Haile Selassie to be the living God. They called him Jah. They believed he was the second coming. They didn't just revere him, they awaited him. When Selassie visited Jamaica in 1966, the reception was chaotic. Thousands of Rastafarians swarmed the airport. People wept. Some claimed to see halos. Selassie, typically reserved, was stunned. According to reports, he asked the pilot to circle the runway before landing multiple times because the crowds were so massive it looked like a political uprising. But it wasn't. It was devotion. And yet, in private, he denied divinity. Politely, frequently. He didn't correct the belief, as much as he dodged it. Like many things in his reign, it was easier to appear powerful than to dissect what that power really meant. As the 1,970 seconds arrived, the image began to fray. Ethiopia faced famine, economic unrest, and mounting political dissent. Selassie, by now an elderly man, increasingly isolated, seemed out of step. His court was opulent, his ministers corrupt. His silence on suffering became deafening. In 1974, he was deposed by a Marxist military junta. No ceremony, no dramatic farewell. Just a quiet arrest and removal from the palace. He died a year later, under disputed circumstances. Officially, heart failure. Unofficially, perhaps something darker. But no autopsy was performed, no state funeral was held. His body disappeared, only to be rediscovered decades later, buried beneath a palace floor. But even now, his image lingers on currency, in statues, and in the hearts of those who still call him divine. Because height is a technicality. Scale is the myth you leave behind. And from one shadowed ruler to another, we stay in the house of Romanov, where another monarch stood barely 157 centimeters tall, married into power, outlived her husband, and ruled an empire not with armies, but with sheer survival. Catherine I of Russia was small in frame, but made of iron. Catherine I of Russia. Catherine I of Russia began life as a servant girl, ended it as an empress, and in between somehow became one of the most improbable rulers in European history. She stood at roughly 157 centimeters, or about 5 feet 2 inches, a height that placed her slightly below average for a woman in early 18th century Russia, and far below what anyone might expect from a monarch who would one day command one of the largest empires on earth. But then again, Catherine was never particularly interested in expectations. She was born Marta Helena Skowronska, probably in 1684, possibly in present-day Latvia or Poland, and certainly into obscurity. Her parents were peasants. She was orphaned young. The next several years of her life read more like a job application than a biography. Servant here, housekeeper there, bounced from household to household like a feather on the wind. Until one day, that feather landed in the path of Peter the Great, a man whose physical height, a towering 6 feet 8 inches, only exaggerated the contrast between them. They were, in every sense, opposites. He, a tempestuous giant, autocrat, and modernizer, with an explosive temper and a habit of dragging his nobles into reforms they didn't ask for. She, a small, pragmatic, illiterate woman with no royal blood, no formal education, and no political training. And yet, against all odds, they became a pair. Not just lovers, not just spouses, but, in a strange way, partners. Catherine understood Peter in a way few others could. She calmed him, balanced him, handled him when his courtiers couldn't. Where others saw a peasant girl pretending to be royal, Peter saw someone who didn't flinch. She was small but unshakable. And in the volatile physics of Russian court life, that was priceless. He married her in secret first, then publicly, and finally crowned her empress consort. She bore him children, followed him on military campaigns, even helped manage the imperial household during his long absences. And in 1724, just a year before his death, he had her crowned empress in her own right, a move so radical, so constitutionally vague, that it left even his most loyal advisors staring at the floor. When Peter died in 1725, the empire trembled. Russia had never been ruled by a woman, and certainly not one born in a barn, barely literate, and shorter than most of her guards. The court was packed with ambitious men, generals, noblemen, statesmen who each considered themselves more qualified, more royal, and more suited to rule. But Catherine had something they didn't: loyalty. Not necessarily to her, but to Peter. And Peter had named her Empress. That was enough. So began one of the most surreal reigns in imperial history. Catherine, I ruled for only 2 years, from 1725 to 1727. It wasn't long, it wasn't groundbreaking, but it was unprecedented. She became the first woman to rule Imperial Russia. And she did it without conquest, without ceremony, without even trying to rewrite history. She ruled like she lived practically. She wasn't a reformer. She didn't launch campaigns. What she did do was survive. She kept the court from tearing itself apart. She maintained Peter's foreign alliances. She managed the endless bureaucracy of Russian governance without any of the bloodletting her advisors expected. And she did it all while looking like someone who might have once swept the halls of the Winter Palace rather than ruled it. And yet, even in her humility, there was calculation. Catherine wasn't dumb, she was underestimated. She allowed herself to be dismissed, gently, as a placeholder, a quiet regent, a political pause. But behind the scenes, she shuffled alliances, reinforced her supporters, and cleared the way for her grandson's eventual rise. She never raised her voice. She didn't need to. She was short, yes, but she moved like someone who knew everyone else was talking too loudly. Her portraits were modest. She didn't demand exaggerated imagery. No towering thrones. No oversized scepters. She appears often seated, in warm lighting, dressed in rich but simple gowns. It's almost deceptive this empress doesn't look like she should be remembered. And yet, she broke a barrier no other woman in Russian history had touched. She proved that power doesn't require ceremony. It requires staying put when others expect you to disappear. When she died in 1727, she was buried next to Peter. Not in a separate tomb, not in symbolic exile, but beside him as an equal, which, in the end, is what she had always been. Not by birth, not by law, but by sheer, unbreakable presence. Catherine I's reign was brief, quiet, and small, but her example wasn't. She opened the door for the next Catherine, the great one, to walk through. And for generations of Russian women to know that 5'2" was plenty tall, if you knew how to stand your ground. And from one empress to another, we now meet her namesake, Catherine the Great, who stood barely taller, at 159 or 160 centimeters, but ruled like a colossus. Because when you're rewriting the fate of an empire, a few missing inches don't matter. Only legacy does. Catherine the Great. She came from nowhere, renamed herself everything, and redefined what it meant to be royal. Catherine the Great, Empress of Russia, stood around 159 to 160 centimeters tall, roughly 5 feet 3 inches, not particularly imposing, not particularly commanding in physical presence. But then again, Catherine never ruled by presence. She ruled by momentum. Born as Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst in 1729, in a minor German principality most Russians couldn't pronounce, she was not born into greatness. She was not expected to rule an empire. She was not expected to survive it either. But when a crown is loose and history is bored, short women with sharp minds become gravitational forces. She arrived in Russia at the age of 14, imported like a decorative political solution, a princess wrapped in polite manners and vague Lutheranism. She learned the language, she learned the religion. More importantly, she learned the court. The glances, the hierarchies, the silences, the rituals, the choreography of surviving under watchful chandeliers, Catherine didn't rise to power. She studied her way into it. Her marriage to the future emperor, Peter III, was many things unhappy, unromantic, uninspiring. But it was also her opening move. While Peter played soldier and collected figurines, Catherine played politics and collected loyalties. She built alliances with generals, diplomats, and ambitious courtiers who saw in her not just a foreign bride, but a potential monarch with teeth. And then, in 1762, when Peter finally made himself too unpopular to protect, Catherine made her move. A coup, bloodless, efficient, and executed with astonishing precision. By the end of it, Peter was out, Catherine was in, and the empire didn't even flinch. A 5'3" German woman had just seized the Russian throne, and she held it for 34 years. She didn't rule from the saddle or the pulpit, she ruled from the desk. Catherine wrote laws, manifestos, letters, thousands of them. She corresponded with Voltaire, Diderot, and Enlightenment thinkers across Europe. Her court was a salon, her empire was a project, and her image was a carefully calibrated paradox. Imperial, but rational. Authoritative, but enlightened. Feminine, but untouchable. And yes, she was small, but you wouldn't know it from her portraits. Catherine was not modest about scale. Her official paintings depict her standing beside enormous columns, sweeping staircases, or battlefield scenes. Her gowns spill like waterfalls. Her posture is immaculate. She gazes not at the viewer, but through time itself. She looks 10 feet tall, and that's by design. She understood what many short rulers come to master. Symbolism is the architecture of power. If people believe you're tall, you are. If they doubt it, you're gone. But her reign was not just smoke and mirrors. She expanded Russia's borders by hundreds of thousands of square miles, absorbing territories from Poland to Crimea. She modernized the bureaucracy, restructured the legal code, and reorganized the provincial administration to function without her. And then, paradoxically, she centralized everything anyway, because trust was a luxury she could never afford. She was pragmatic, ruthless, in moments, even reformist. She abolished capital punishment in theory, if not always in practice. She flirted with ending serfdom before realizing that an empire built on labor doesn't like freedom until it's profitable. Her enlightenment had limits, but so did her enemies, and unlike most emperors, she knew where hers were. At court, she moved with elegance but governed with steel. She wore jewels the size of apricots and carried herself like marble on legs. Her shortness, always present, was never discussed. It didn't need to be. It had been overwritten by command. But perhaps the most telling measure of Catherine's scale was how she outgrew her own legacy. Over time, gossip and myth inflated everything around her. Her romances, her ambitions, her vanity. She became too large to be just one thing. To some, she was a despot in pearls. To others, a philosopher in disguise. But to the historians who kept digging, she was something simpler and more disturbing. A mirror. She ruled like the people around her wanted to believe monarchs could, until they didn't. She died in 1796, leaving behind an empire vastly larger, wealthier, and more centralized than the one she inherited. Her body, barely over 5 feet tall, was laid to rest in the Peter and Paul Cathedral, surrounded by men who'd measured power in inches and swords, and who she had outlived, outmaneuvered, and outgoverned. So yes, Catherine the Great was short, but calling her short is like calling lightning warm. It's technically true. it's also missing the point. And now we shift to her son, Paul I of Russia, a man who spent his life trying to fill a throne that his mother had made too large, too heavy, and too radiant. He stood around 166 centimeters, but his shadow never caught up to hers. Because some rulers are born to rule, others are born in the dark corners they never fully escape. Paul I of Russia. Paul I was the son of an empress and the heir to an empire, but he always ruled like a man, trying to get out from under a shadow, his mother's, mostly, but also his own. Standing at around 166 centimeters, approximately 5 feet 5 inches, Paul wasn't unusually short for the 18th century, but in comparison to the towering legacy of Catherine the Great, he always seemed to come up lacking. It didn't help that for much of his early life, he wasn't allowed to do very much. His mother, despite being a woman ruling in a deeply patriarchal age, never once considered giving him any real power while she lived. She didn't trust him. She didn't hide it. And Paul, who grew up steeped in paranoia, ceremonial flattery, and psychological isolation, never forgot. He was born in 1754, declared heir to the throne at age 8, and then left to marinate for 40 years while Catherine expanded the empire, redefined autocracy, and polished her legend. Paul's life during those years was a cocktail of formality, bitterness, and barely concealed resentment. He built his own court in miniature. He surrounded himself with yes-men and micromanaged table settings. He wrote critiques of military uniforms. He created his own little empire inside Catherine's and waited. And then, in 1796, she died. According to some accounts, Catherine had hoped to bypass Paul entirely and pass the crown to his son, Alexander. But death doesn't negotiate, and Paul became emperor at last. His coronation was immediate. His agenda was personal. He didn't rise to the throne, he lunged at it. The moment he had power, he set about dismantling everything his mother had built. He reversed her policies. He purged her allies. He gave orders to replace her court rituals with his own, more austere versions. He banned the French fashion that had become ubiquitous in Russian high society. He even ordered that her remains be removed from their temporary resting place and buried properly next to his father, whom Catherine had allegedly sidelined, or worse. He wanted to restore the monarchy's dignity. Yes, but mostly, he wanted to rewrite the narrative. He wanted to remind everyone who was in charge now. And yet, for all this theatrical vengeance, Paul ruled like a man unsure of his own dimensions. He was fastidious to the point of mania. He obsessed over military drills, dress codes, and seating arrangements. He issued thousands of decrees, many of them minute, contradictory, or absurdly pedantic. Soldiers were forbidden to wear round hats. Courtiers were reprimanded for their posture. Ambassadors were made to memorize entire oaths. He made his presence known not through charisma or command, but through rules. Height became a metaphor for everything he couldn't control. Where Catherine had stood figuratively tall, welcoming Enlightenment thinkers, expanding borders, flirting with liberal ideas before discarding them, Paul made himself small through obsession. He wasn't just short in stature, he was constrained. He narrowed his vision until power felt measurable in inches and etiquette. But he wasn't stupid. Paul had genuine administrative ideas. He sought to reduce corruption in the nobility. He tried to improve conditions for serfs, albeit marginally. He wanted Russia to be strong, but also orderly, respectable, disciplined. Unfortunately, his methods often bordered on the deranged, and his personality didn't help. Foreign diplomats described him as erratic, suspicious, and prone to sudden outbursts. one moment charming, the next belligerent. His eyes were said to dart around like a man constantly expecting betrayal, which, ironically, made betrayal more likely. By the early 1800s, a group of disaffected nobles, many of them veterans of Catherine's glittering court, had had enough. They viewed Paul not just as eccentric, but dangerous. His foreign policy had begun veering toward alliance with Napoleon, alarming Britain and Austria. His domestic behavior had alienated the military. His style of rule was not regal. They claimed it was volatile. And so, in 1801, they killed him. Not in battle, not in exile, but in his own bedroom. Assassinated by officers in the palace, his own guards conveniently absent. He died not with a roar, but with a thud, the final punctuation on a reign that had lasted barely 5 years. His son, Alexander I, immediately took the throne and set about distancing himself from Paul's legacy. The era of strange decrees and second-hand vengeance was over. Catherine's shadow returned, gently swallowing the memory of her son. Paul was buried with honours, but never quite with reverence. His life remains a cautionary tale in royal history, not because of how he rose, but because of how he tried to rise and never quite escaped the floor. His was the tragedy of a man who believed power could be restored by rules, structure, and posture, who believed that wearing the uniform properly was enough to remake the man inside it. And from one royal overcorrector to another, we move next to a queen who tried to carry her country through war, exile, and neutrality while barely topping 163 centimeters. Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands may not have looked like a fighter, but she held her ground while nations collapsed around her. Queen Wilhelmina, Netherlands. At first glance, Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands didn't look like a ruler who would stand firm against Hitler, outmaneuver a royal exile, or become the longest reigning monarch in Dutch history. She stood at about 163 centimeters, around 5 feet 4 inches, small in frame, modest in bearing, and often dwarfed by the military men and politicians who surrounded her. But as with so many monarchs on this list, her power didn't come from height. It came from timing, tenacity, and a refusal to be anyone other than exactly who she was. Born in 1880, Wilhelmina became queen at the tender age of 10, after the death of her father, King William III. Of course, at that age, the throne was largely ceremonial, held in regency by her mother, Queen Emma. But even as a child, Wilhelmina took her role seriously. She wasn't playful, giddy, or particularly interested in being admired. She was strategic, reserved, watching, waiting. And when she came of age at 18 and assumed full control of the monarchy, people were surprised by the steel behind her calm eyes. A small queen, but not a meek one. Wilhelmina's early reign was marked by composure. She navigated the turn of the century, the delicate balance of Dutch neutrality during World War I, and a complex parliamentary system that often saw the monarchy as ornamental at best. But Wilhelmina didn't do ornaments. She did resolve. She understood that power, for a monarch in a constitutional system, wasn't about decrees, it was about symbolism. And she wielded that symbolism like a blade. During World War I, she maintained neutrality, but refused to bow to pressure from either side. German Kaiser Wilhelm II, her cousin, once called her the only man in the Dutch government. She didn't flinch, didn't correct him. She knew exactly what he meant and exactly how far from a compliment it was intended to be. But in a government full of tall men who blinked at pressure, Wilhelmina's quiet heightlessness became a kind of anchor. Then came World War II, and with it, her defining chapter. In 1940, Nazi Germany invaded the Netherlands. The Dutch military was quickly overwhelmed. The royal family faced the impossible choice: stay and be captured, or flee and lead from abroad. Wilhelmina chose exile, but she did not go quietly. She boarded a British destroyer and sailed to London, where she established a government in exile and immediately began broadcasting radio speeches back to her occupied country. It's difficult to overstate how powerful those broadcasts were. Her voice, carried over Radio Orange, became the sound of hope for the Dutch people. Measured, firm, unshaken, she never ranted, never wailed. She spoke like a monarch who refused to be minimized, like someone who had spent her whole life being underestimated and had finally decided she was done with it. She called Hitler the arch-enemy of mankind. She referred to Nazi occupation as a darkness that cannot last, and through it all, she remained quietly, unshakably Dutch, in exile but not absent, in hiding but not silenced. Even Churchill admired her. He once said she was the only woman he'd met who made him feel like a schoolboy. She had that effect, this small, unflashy queen, wrapped in dark fabric, speaking like the world was watching, and it mattered what she said. When the war ended, Wilhelmina returned to the Netherlands, not in triumph, but in solidarity. She visited bomb towns, spoke with survivors, refused to re-establish the monarchy as a pedestal. Instead, she wanted it to be a presence, visible, tangible, humble. Her popularity soared, but her health began to decline. In 1948, after 50 years on the throne, she abdicated in favor of her daughter, Juliana. The decision wasn't forced. It was considered thoughtful, as most of Wilhelmina's decisions had been. She believed monarchy should not be a lifelong prison, and she was one of the first modern monarchs to step down willingly, setting a precedent that other European royals would later follow. She retired to a relatively quiet life, occasionally writing, occasionally advising, but mostly watching the country she'd carried through occupation find its new, post-war identity. When she died in 1962, her funeral was marked not by lavishness, but by gratitude. The people remembered her not as a celebrity monarch or a romanticized figurehead, but as someone who had shown up when it mattered most. There's something beautifully understated about Wilhelmina's reign. No dramatic scandals, no overblown mythologies, no exaggerated self-importance. Just a small woman in sensible shoes, standing between her country and collapse, and refusing to blink. And from one queen who outlasted tyranny to another who was born into it, we now descend into the dark wood-panelled corridors of Tudor England. Mary I, daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, stood at just 155 to 157 centimeters, but what she lacked in physical size, she made up for in fierce conviction, troubled legacy, and one of the most infamous royal nicknames in history. Mary I of England. She stood at just 155 to 157 centimeters tall, around 5 feet 1 inch. But Mary III of England carried the full weight of Tudor expectation, Catholic hope, dynastic trauma, and the psychological debris of growing up under Henry VIII. Her reign would last only 5 years, but her name Bloody Mary would echo for centuries, conjuring both fascination and fear. But behind the nickname, the executions, and the propaganda was a queen whose small stature masked a far more complicated tragedy. A life lived in the long shadow of other people's mistakes. Born in 1516 to Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, Mary began life as a highly celebrated royal child. She was the legitimate heir, the political prize, the little princess who knew her Latin declensions and could play the virginals like a court-trained prodigy. But from the start, her height was remarked upon, slight, pale, thin-featured. Even as a child, she was more serious than sweet. Her tutors noted her intelligence and discipline, but also her precocious solemnity. She smiled rarely. She worked constantly. She was being prepared for greatness in a world that was about to implode. And then came Anne Boleyn. Henry's obsession with a male heir meant Mary's world was turned inside out. Her mother was cast aside. Her own legitimacy was publicly revoked. She went from princess to bastard overnight and was forced to serve in the household of her infant half-sister, Elizabeth. Her rooms were taken, her jewels reclaimed, her name rewritten in legal records. Mary was not just politically demoted, she was psychologically diminished. But she never broke. Her height became an almost symbolic detail in this period. A small girl, shoulders squared, refusing to call her mother Dowager Princess, refusing to accept her own illegitimacy, refusing to bow to a court that now treated her like a servant. She was, in every way, in the way a living reminder of the Catholic marriage Henry wanted to forget. But Mary never forgot. Her Catholicism wasn't just faith, it was identity, it was resistance. She survived. That's the miracle. Through the deaths of Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, and the others. Through the volatile reign of her half-brother Edward VI, through exile, humiliation, and political exile within her own country, Mary endured. And in 1553, at the age of 37, she became queen. Her ascension was far from guaranteed. Edward's will attempted to block her, naming Lady Jane Grey, a distant Protestant cousin, as his successor. But the people rallied behind Mary. Not out of passion, perhaps, but out of principle. She was the true heir, the daughter of a king and queen, the living link to the pre-Reformation past. And so, the little woman who had spent her life waiting in the wings walked onto the stage. And the applause didn't last. Mary ruled with an intensity that came less from ambition and more from vindication. She believed she had been given the throne by divine justice to restore the true church, to undo the Protestant Reformation, to bring England back to its Catholic roots. And in pursuit of that mission, she became ruthless. Hundreds of Protestants were executed under her watch, including bishops and high-profile dissenters. The Marian burnings, as they would come to be known, would forever tarnish her name. But it wasn't sadism, it was certainty. Mary didn't rule by charisma. She lacked her father's theatricality, her mother's charm, and her sister, Elizabeth's political finesse. She ruled by faith, by rules, by doctrine. She saw herself as a vessel of divine will, and in that framework, mercy was a distraction. Her small frame belied a will as inflexible as stone. Even in personal matters, Mary was more duty than desire. Her marriage to Philip II of Spain was a political maneuver. She hoped it would produce a Catholic heir and seal the religious fate of England. It didn't. Philip was distant, cold, and largely disinterested. The alliance was unpopular. The people feared Spanish influence. And Mary, lonely, aging, childless, was left with a country that felt increasingly hostile to the very mission she believed she was born to complete. Her health began to fail. There were phantom pregnancies, likely psychosomatic, the result of desperation and hormonal imbalance. She continued to govern, but her influence waned. The fires of religious reform she had tried to extinguish kept smouldering beneath the surface, and her sister, Elizabeth, now a Protestant icon in waiting, stood quietly in the wings. Mary died in 1558, after just 5 years on the throne. She was only 42 years old. No triumph, no lineage, no redemption. Just a small, stubborn queen who believed herself right and who history, for better or worse, has never quite forgiven. But her story isn't one of cruelty. It's one of scale. A small woman trying to carry a dying dynasty. A ruler trapped between two centuries. A monarch whose body, like her beliefs, was always under scrutiny, too small, too barren, too late. And speaking of rulers who refused to conform to their bodies, we now turn to her half-sister Elizabeth I, whose own reign would outshine nearly every monarch in English history. Despite her height estimated at just 160 centimeters, a queen who built an empire while carefully constructing her image, inch by inch, layer by layer, pearl by pearl, Elizabeth I of England. If Mary I ruled by conviction, her half-sister Elizabeth ruled by calculation. Where Mary was certain, Elizabeth was strategic. Where Mary burned, Elizabeth waited. And while the two sisters were not dramatically different in height, Elizabeth stood at approximately 160 centimeters, or 5 feet 3 inches. They were worlds apart in legacy, myth, and the use of space. Mary seemed to shrink under the weight of her own beliefs. Elizabeth, despite being scarcely taller, learned to expand. She didn't just rule England, she staged England. Born in 1533, Elizabeth came into the world with a title that was immediately under threat. As the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, her legitimacy was always conditional. Her mother was executed before Elizabeth turned 3. Her status flipped more times than a royal edict. First legitimate heir, then bastard, then potential pawn in a Protestant marriage alliance, then somehow a princess again. And through it all, she grew up small, smart, and very, very observant. She learned early that silence was safer than opinion. That height might help you in a sword fight, but in court politics, timing was everything. When she eventually inherited the throne in 1558, after the deaths of her brother Edward VI and her sister Mary I, Elizabeth was 25 years old, unmarried, untested, and according to European diplomats, too slight and too uncertain to last long. They underestimated her. Everyone did. That was the first and last time anyone made that mistake while she was alive. Elizabeth's reign would go on to define an era literally. The Elizabethan Age, Shakespeare, Sea Dogs, Sir Walter Raleigh, the defeat of the Spanish Armada. But at its center stood a queen whose physical presence was anything but commanding. She was slim, pale, and in later life, visibly aged. Her face was marked by pock scars, her teeth decayed. She stood no taller than the average Tudor woman, and by modern standards would barely stand out in a crowd. But she never needed to stand out physically. She constructed a version of herself that filled every room before she entered it. That's the genius of Elizabeth I. She weaponized appearance. She wore towering collars, billowing gowns, and wigs stacked like battlements. Her hair became flame, her eyes cold flint. She cultivated an image of divine femininity reinforced by pearls, gold, and layers, literal layers of fabric, symbolism, and control. Her court was a mirror house. She showed people what they wanted to see, and they left convinced they had seen God's will. The portraits are telling. Not one of them presents her as she was. In the rainbow portrait, Elizabeth appears ageless, immortal, her gown embroidered with eyes and ears, a serpent on her sleeve, a rainbow in her hand. She's no longer a queen, she's an allegory. By then, she had long stopped being measured in inches. But behind the icon was a woman who understood limitation intimately. She refused to marry not out of romantic purity, but because marriage would shrink her. To marry meant to serve another, to produce an heir meant to admit mortality. She preferred myth. The Virgin Queen, the married to my people monarch, the mother of the nation who needed no husband. In truth, her refusal to marry was a political strategy and an existential shield. It kept foreign powers guessing, kept nobles hopeful, and kept the crown from being diluted. For a ruler barely 5'3", she took up enormous political space and guarded it with everything she had. Her speeches, famously spare, were delivered with theatrical flair. At Tilbury, facing the threat of Spanish invasion, she told her troops, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king." It's hard to find a more explicit acknowledgement of her size and her deliberate transcendence of it. She didn't deny being small. She reframed it as part of the drama. Yes, I'm short. Yes, I'm a woman. And I'm still in charge. Elizabeth's greatest victory wasn't military, it was narrative. She outlasted her enemies, outmaneuvered her allies, and outlived her relevance, ruling for 45 years and dying without ever naming an heir. Her final years were quiet, melancholic. She stood for hours because she feared that lying down would mean death, her once radiant face now hidden beneath more makeup than flesh. But she remained queen to the very end, still untouchable, still alone, still sovereign. When she died in 1603, the Tudor dynasty ended with her. No children, no husband. Just a coffin that carried 5'3" of royal contradiction. A woman born to be silenced who became the voice of an age. A queen who never needed to grow taller because she had already become a monument. And speaking of unlikely monuments, we now travel south to medieval Spain, where Isabella I of Castile, the architect of a unified Spain and one of the most formidable rulers of the 15th century, stood just 150 to 154 centimeters tall. She didn't need a sword to conquer kingdoms. She had something sharper, belief sharpened into policy. And Spain has never recovered. Isabella I of Castile. She was barely 150 to 154 centimeters tall, roughly 5 feet even on her best day. But Isabella I of Castile stood at the crossroads of history and bent it to her will. Not with size, not with spectacle, but with willpower so unflinching it could make empires blink. She wasn't merely a queen, she was an architect of dynasties, of dogma, of disaster. In her small frame, she carried both the crown of a kingdom and the burden of a continent's irreversible future. Born in 1451, Isabella was a royal afterthought for most of her early life. As a younger half-sister in a turbulent court, she was not immediately groomed for power. Her claim to the throne of Castile was murky at best, legally contested, and politically inconvenient. She was kept close but not respected, royal in blood but peripheral in politics. The kind of princess people underestimated out of sheer laziness, which, in hindsight, was a mistake. Because Isabella had two dangerous things on her side, time and patience. By the time she reached her late teens, Spain was a mosaic of fractured kingdoms, competing aristocracies, and religious power struggles. Castile, the largest and richest of the Iberian realms, was spiraling into chaos under the ineffectual rule of her half-brother, King Henry IV. Succession was unclear. Rumors swirled that Henry's heir, Juana la Beltraneja, was illegitimate. Civil war loomed. The moment was ripe for someone, anyone, to step in and claim authority. And into this power vacuum walked a small young woman with unwavering Catholic faith, steel trap intellect, and a secret marriage plan. In 1469, against the explicit wishes of her half-brother and many of Castile's nobles, Isabella secretly married Ferdinand of Aragon. It was a political bombshell. Not only did it defy the king's orders, it combined the two most powerful thrones in Spain. Their marriage, once ratified and accepted, would eventually unify the country under a single crown. But that wasn't destiny. That was engineering. Isabella saw a chessboard where others saw a jigsaw puzzle. She didn't move pieces, she redesigned the board. When Henry IV died in 1474, Isabella seized the moment. She had herself crowned Queen of Castile with all the force of ceremony and none of the royal permission. War broke out. Of course, Juana's supporters weren't going to let her go quietly, but Isabella held the line. She rallied allies, secured papal support, and leaned on her unassuming presence as both shield and sword. At a time when queens were supposed to be ornamental, Isabella was executive. And yet, she never presented herself as a revolutionary. She didn't demand to be seen as extraordinary. She used tradition to her advantage, wore the right robes, knelt at the right altars, bowed at the right thresholds. But behind the veil of piety was someone rewriting the rules in real time. She wasn't loud, she wasn't theatrical, but her decisions thundered through history. She and Ferdinand restructured the government, tamed the nobility, and turned Castile into a functioning administrative machine. She reformed the military, strengthened the crown's finances, and streamlined royal justice. But her deepest legacy, the one still argued, mourned, and mythologized, was her religious policy. In 1492, the same year Columbus sailed west under her banner, Isabella and Ferdinand issued the Alhambra Decree, expelling all practicing Jews from Spain. It was one of the most devastating and far-reaching religious purges in European history. Thousands were forced to convert or flee. Entire communities were dismantled, families torn apart, wealth confiscated, cultural legacies burned, erased, or exiled. It wasn't just policy, it was cleansing. And though Ferdinand's name was on the decree too, it was Isabella's faith and her obsession with religious unity that drove it. She believed in purity, in divine order, in the fantasy of a Spain that was not merely Catholic, but universally so. Her small frame carried a vision that spanned oceans and centuries. She financed Columbus's voyage not out of whimsy, but out of design. A shortcut to India was nice. A new world for Christian dominance was better. And still, she remained personally austere. She wore simple clothes, slept little, travelled extensively across her realm. She was not a monarch of distance, but of direct contact. Her subjects often remarked that she looked more like a nun than a queen, pale, small, grave, but always there, listening, calculating, commanding in a whisper. When she died in 1504, Spain was no longer a regional power, it was the rising engine of global empire. Her will expressed regret for not having done more to convert the non-Christian world. Her body was buried beside Ferdinand's, as per her wishes, in a plain tomb far more modest than her impact. Today, Isabella remains a contradiction, a saint to some, a tyrant to others, a symbol of national unity and of cultural destruction. Her height was never her feature. Her shadow, however, still hangs over continents. And from one mythic monarch to another, we head east to feudal Japan, where a warlord of humble origin and famously short stature reshaped the political map with pure force of will. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, standing just 153 to 158 centimeters, rose from peasant to ruler in one generation. Because in a fractured land of tall swords and fragile alliances, being underestimated was the greatest advantage of all. Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Japan. In the annals of Japanese history, Toyotomi Hideyoshi occupies a place so unlikely it borders on myth. He was not born into nobility. He did not inherit a title. He had no ancestral castle, no family crest worth mentioning, and no apparent destiny beyond the rice fields. He was short around 153 to 158 centimeters, or roughly 5 feet to 5 feet 2 inches. In feudal Japan, where warlords wore their stature like armor and clan names carried more weight than armies, Hideyoshi had neither. But what he did have was a mind like wildfire and a talent for survival that defied every precedent. They called him the monkey. Not affectionately, his contemporaries remarked on his sunken cheeks, protruding ears, long arms, and wiry frame. His features were exaggerated, his skin darkened by labor, his mannerisms too quick, too twitchy, too peasant-like for the lacquered courts of Kyoto. Samurai dismissed him as uncouth. Aristocrats looked down on him, literally and figuratively. But if he noticed, he never showed it. And if he cared, he didn't let it slow him down. Because Toyotomi Hideyoshi wasn't trying to be respected. He was trying to win. Born in 1537 to a humble foot soldier, or possibly a low-ranking ashigaru, Hideyoshi's early life was defined by constant movement. He had no fixed path to power, so he made one. Through a combination of charm, adaptability, and almost supernatural loyalty, he rose in the ranks under Oda Nobunaga, the fearsome daimyo, who began the process of unifying Japan. Hideyoshi was not a great warrior. He wasn't physically imposing. He didn't command fear in the way that Nobunaga did, but he commanded trust. He had a tactical mind. He could organize logistics, read people, memorize terrain, and execute complex plans with the precision of a mathematician and the flair of a gambler. He was indispensable, and he knew it. When Nobunaga was betrayed and forced to commit suicide in 1582, it was Hideyoshi who acted first. He avenged his master, defeated the usurper, and claimed control over Nobunaga's territories not by birthright, but by maneuver. This shocked the samurai class. A peasant-born commander taking over from one of the most feared daimyo in Japanese history, it was unheard of, and yet none could stop him. Over the next decade, Hideyoshi would complete what Nobunaga had started, the unification of Japan. He did it not by brute force, but by a kind of political aikido. He married strategically, negotiated relentlessly, co-opted his enemies and outflanked the rest. When needed, he was ruthless, but never needlessly so. He built alliances as often as he raised castles, and he made sure that every step upward was solid before taking the next. And yet, his size remained a point of curiosity. He never matched the towering presence of his rivals. Portraits of Hideyoshi, often painted after his death, show a slender man in oversized robes, face taut with calculation. He rarely smiled. His eyes were sharp, his fingers long and expressive, more the hands of a scholar than a soldier. His shortness never disappeared, but somehow it stopped mattering. Because Hideyoshi didn't just rise, he remade the structure he rose through. By 1585, he had been named Kampaku, or Imperial Regent. The emperor, technically the most divine figure in Japan, recognized him formally, granting him legitimacy that his bloodline never could. By 1590, he was the de facto ruler of the country. He governed from Osaka Castle, a fortress as massive and intimidating as its master was physically unimposing. The contradiction wasn't lost on anyone. Under his rule, Hideyoshi enacted sweeping reforms. He implemented a caste system, froze social mobility, and forbade the peasantry from owning weapons, a move known as the sword hunt. He standardized taxation, rebuilt infrastructure, patronized the arts, and tried to extend his legacy into permanence. But even in all of this, he knew that bloodlines mattered. He had no noble ancestry, and for much of his life, no heir. In his later years, when a son was finally born, he became obsessed with preserving the dynasty he had built from scratch. He appointed regents, reshaped succession plans, and tried to force loyalty where legacy could not. And then came his great overreach, the invasions of Korea. Flush with power and legacy anxiety, Hideyoshi launched a massive military campaign in the 1,590 seconds to conquer the Korean peninsula and eventually China. It was a grandiose move, a gamble, and ultimately, a disaster. His forces were bogged down, overextended, and beaten back. The war drained resources and goodwill. His myth, so carefully constructed, began to crack. He died in 1598, before the war concluded. His son was too young to rule, and within a few years, his entire lineage was swept aside by Tokugawa Ieyasu, a rival warlord who played the long game better. Hideyoshi's dynasty died, but his story lived on. Today, he's remembered as one of Japan's 3 great unifiers, along with Nobunaga and Tokugawa, but he's also the most improbable of them. A man who rose from the mud, stood shorter than most, and left behind castles, policies, and legends that still shape Japan today. And now, from the ashes of Hideyoshi's failed dynasty, we pass to the very man who succeeded him, Tokugawa Ieyasu, another small-statured ruler, estimated between 155 and 160 centimeters, who didn't conquer by drama, but by endurance. Where Hideyoshi raced upward, Ieyasu waited, and waited, and then took everything. Tokugawa Ieyasu, Japan. He was short, possibly 155 to 160 centimeters tall, or roughly 5 feet 1 inch to 5 feet 3 inches, right in the unremarkable middle of Japan's Sengoku period warlords, where height didn't dictate strength so much as patience did. And no one, absolutely no one, had more patience than Tokugawa Ieyasu. If Toyotomi Hideyoshi was the peasant upstart who sprinted to the top, Ieyasu was the shadow who waited at the bottom, still and calculating until the top came crashing down. He outlived everyone, outlasted everything, and when the smoke cleared from centuries of feudal infighting, he wasn't the tallest, but he was the only one left standing. Born in 1543, during one of the most violent periods in Japanese history, Ieyasu began his life not as a future ruler, but as a hostage, literally. At age 6, he was sent to a rival clan as a political pawn, standard practice in Sengoku diplomacy, his life for their peace. It didn't build confidence, but it built strategy. Ieyasu learned early that control didn't always come from swords. Sometimes it came from waiting to pick up the pieces. As a young samurai lord, he allied himself with the meteoric Oda Nobunaga, and later with Hideyoshi, both of whom blazed across the political landscape with fire and fury. Ieyasu was slower, more deliberate, and often overlooked. He wasn't a charismatic general or a revolutionary administrator. He didn't change history with a speech or a siege. He just persisted one tactical alliance, one careful surrender, one incremental victory at a time. And always in the background, that small figure, never boasting, never rushing. His enemies called him cautious. His allies called him boring. But when Hideyoshi died in 1598, it was Ieyasu, not any of the other high-ranking generals, who was positioned to inherit what Hideyoshi had failed to secure, a future. There were complications, of course. Hideyoshi had appointed a council of 5 regents to protect his young son, and Ieyasu was one of them. He immediately began testing boundaries, forming secret alliances, strengthening his base in Edo, modern-day Tokyo, and preparing for what everyone quietly knew was coming: a final, definitive civil war. That war arrived in 1600, at the Battle of Sekigahara, the largest and most decisive clash in samurai history. Ieyasu, though physically unimposing, was psychologically massive by this point. His army was better fed, better positioned, and better informed. He bribed enemy commanders in advance. He played a long, quiet game of betrayal until the battlefield tipped in his favor. The battle ended in hours. The war ended with it. 3 years later, Ieyasu was named shogun by the emperor, an official recognition of the power he had already secured. And with that, the Tokugawa shogunate was born. He was 60 years old, and he would rule for only 2 more years before abdicating in favor of his son. But don't let that fool you. The title may have passed, but the control didn't. Ieyasu retired in name only, pulling strings from behind the curtain like a master puppeteer. He reorganized the daimyo system, developed a rigid social hierarchy, and imposed a foreign policy of near-total isolation that would define Japan for over 250 years. And all of it, every castle wall, every tax code, every rice-counting bureaucrat, stood on the foundation of one man's quiet, determined ascent. It's tempting to call Ieyasu a cautious ruler, but that undersells the brilliance. He wasn't cautious, he was slow-burning. There's a difference. Cautious men avoid danger. Ieyasu invited it, then calmly dismantled it. He didn't conquer cities through flash or spectacle. He smothered opposition with inevitability. Even his physical presence followed suit. He wasn't dramatic or flamboyant like Hideyoshi. He didn't wear outsized clothing or cultivate mystique. His portraits show a man with hooded eyes, high cheekbones, and a serene, almost clerical expression. He looks more like a calligraphy teacher than the founder of Japan's most durable military regime. But don't be fooled by the lack of height or the lack of drama. This was a man who saw further than anyone else around him. And while taller samurai stood on the front lines shouting orders, Ieyasu stood behind them, all planning for the next generation, the next policy, the next century. When he died in 1616, his funeral was elaborate, but his legacy needed no ceremony. His shogunate would last until 1868. That's over 250 years of Tokugawa rule. He had ended the age of civil war, unified the nation, built the infrastructure of peace, and he'd done it all without ever raising his voice or his head. Because height, in the end, was a distraction. Ieyasu never needed to be tall. He just needed to wait for everyone else to fall. And now, from the silent architects of medieval Japan to the spectacle of 19th century imperial ceremony, we move west to a man often remembered in portraits and uniforms, yet who stood barely 155 to 160 centimeters. Emperor Meiji, modernizer of Japan, looked more like a schoolboy than a sovereign, but his ambition was tall enough to erase centuries in a single reign. Emperor Meiji, and he stood somewhere between 155 and 160 centimeters tall, just about 5 feet 1 inch to 5 feet 3 inches, but Emperor Meiji loomed larger than almost anyone else in modern Japanese history. He didn't conquer kingdoms. He didn't lead armies into battle, but from the confines of a palace he rarely left. And from behind ceremonial screens he rarely emerged. Meiji reshaped Japan from a secluded archipelago into an industrial world power, and did it all without ever appearing particularly imposing. Born in 1852 as Mutsuhito, the boy who would become Emperor Meiji was never expected to wield real political power. The Japanese emperor, by then, was a ceremonial figurehead, a living deity who presided over rituals but not decisions. Power belonged to the Tokugawa shogunate, a military regime that had ruled Japan for over 250 years. The emperor's role was spiritual, static, and symbolic. And yet, by the time Meiji was a teenager, the world had changed. The arrival of Commodore Perry in 1853 with his black ships and demands for trade forced open Japan's ports and shattered the illusion of isolation. Western powers were at the door, and the Tokugawa regime found itself caught between clinging to tradition and adapting to survive. In the chaos that followed, rebels, reformers, and samurai factions rallied around a radical idea: restore the emperor, dismantle the shogunate, and modernize before it was too late. In 1867, at the age of 14, Meiji ascended the throne. 1 year later, the Meiji Restoration began, and with it, the most dramatic and rapid transformation of a nation-state in modern history. But here's the paradox. While the world would come to associate Meiji's name with change, power, and national awakening, the man himself remained distant, quiet, and physically unimposing. His portraits were carefully staged to correct this. In paintings and early photographs, Meiji is shown in military uniform, decorated, stiff, and commanding. But even then, something always seems a little off. The boots are large, the sword is long, the posture forced. His face, almost boyish even in adulthood, looks like it's caught somewhere between duty and discomfort. He doesn't look like a ruler of empires. He looks like someone trying to stand inside the shape of one. And that's exactly what he was. Because in reality, Meiji didn't govern through personal charisma or public oration. He rarely spoke in public at all. His court appearances were infrequent. His daily life was heavily scripted. Much of his power was delegated to advisors, ministers, and a new generation of reformist statesmen who used his name as a seal of legitimacy. He was the idea of authority, not its voice. And yet, under that idea, Japan changed more completely in 50 years than most countries do in 2 centuries. Meiji's government abolished the samurai class. It rewrote the tax system. It created a national army, introduced universal education, built railways, launched a postal service, and rewrote the legal code. It imported Western science, military training, and industrial methods, while trying, desperately, to preserve Japanese identity in the process. And Meiji, for all his quietness, for all his heightlessness, embodied the contradiction. He wore Western uniforms but kept Japanese ceremony. He rode in trains and drank wine, but insisted on imperial rituals that stretched back 1,000 years. He was both symbol and stranger to his own revolution. And yes, his size was occasionally noted by foreign observers. Western diplomats commented on his slightness, his delicate frame, the way he seemed to recede into his own clothing. But they also commented often in the same breath on his composure, his sharpness, and his ability to command attention without commanding space. That was Meiji's true skill. He let others fill the room with ideas and policies, while he stood quietly in the background, lending them divine legitimacy. In a country still navigating between feudalism and modernity, having a small, silent emperor who never contradicted but always validated was, somehow, exactly what Japan needed. He didn't bark orders. He didn't campaign. He didn't make dramatic speeches about progress or destiny. He simply endured through assassinations, uprisings, civil wars, and foreign pressures. And in doing so, he became the anchor of transformation. When he died in 1912, Japan mourned not just a monarch, but an era. The Meiji period had turned the country from a fragile, inward-looking shogunate into a rising global power with an industrial economy and imperial ambitions of its own. And it had done so under the watch of a man who never tried to make himself appear larger than life, just larger than the past. Today, statues of Meiji show him mounted on horseback, cast in bronze, looming far above the average pedestrian. It's an irony he might have appreciated. Because the emperor, who rarely left his palace, who barely spoke in public, who stood just over 5 feet tall, now towers over a country he helped reshape. And now, from one small man surrounded by myth to another, this time not in silk robes or military jackets, but in pressed uniforms and hard stares, we shift to 20th century Spain, where Francisco Franco, standing around 163 centimeters, ruled with silence, fear, and longevity that made him as permanent as concrete. Francisco Franco. He stood at about 163 centimeters tall, 5 feet 4 inches, just short enough to be average, just tall enough to be overlooked, and just quiet enough that people often underestimated him. Which, in hindsight, was their mistake. Francisco Franco wasn't a dramatic figure. He didn't shout. He didn't charm. He didn't pretend to be larger than life. What he did was outweight the world. In the catalogue of 20th century strongmen, Franco is the least cinematic. There's no charismatic mania, no flamboyant gestures, no cult of personality painted in revolutionary murals. Franco didn't roar into a room, he slipped into it and locked the doors behind him. His rise to power was not a meteoric ascent, but a slow, relentless seep, like water through stone. And through that seepage, he would become the head of state for nearly 4 decades, one of the longest-serving authoritarian leaders of modern Europe. And he did it all while rarely looking physically imposing. Born in 1,892 inches, the coastal city of Ferrol, Franco came from a naval family but ended up in the army by all accounts, not because of passion, but because of structure. He wasn't a brilliant student or a standout in stature. He was methodical, disciplined, quiet to the point of discomfort. But he excelled in one environment, the chaos of colonial war. As a young officer in Morocco during the Rif War, Franco proved to be unnervingly calm under pressure. His fellow officers were often taller, louder, and more naturally commanding. But they died. Franco survived, again and again. And from that survival came a kind of myth, not of greatness, but of inevitability. By the time the Spanish Republic collapsed into civil war in 1936, Franco had positioned himself carefully, not too close to the faltering monarchy, not too loud in the politics of the Republic. He wasn't a headline. He was a backup plan, the kind of leader you turn to when all the other ones have self-destructed. When the coup against the Republic turned into full-scale war, Franco emerged as the nationalist figurehead not by dramatic victory, but by surviving his competitors. General Mola died in a plane crash. Other fascist leaders were assassinated, discredited, or sidelined. Franco simply remained. He wore his uniform with the precision of a man trying not to be noticed for the wrong reasons. His boots polished, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable. He didn't smile often. He didn't need to. His presence didn't project emotion, it absorbed it. And when he won the Spanish Civil War in 1939, Franco declared himself Jefe del Estado, head of state. Not king, not president, not even generalissimo at first, just the person in charge. It was a coronation in all but name, and he wore power like a military coat. Tightly, carefully, and without letting it wrinkle. His regime, like the man himself, was defined by contradictions held in tension. Spain, under Franco, was nationalist, but officially monarchist, with no monarch. Catholic, but militarized. Anti-communist, but distrustful of capitalism. Isolated, but dependent. It was a state built less on ideology than on control. He ran it like a fortress, secret police, censorship, political purges. But he didn't scream like Mussolini or posture like Hitler. He ruled with the emotional temperature of a filing cabinet. His speeches were short, his interviews rare, his symbolism muted. He made himself boring on purpose, an unglamorous face for a violently enforced calm. And his height, always hovering just below the average, was rendered irrelevant by how little he moved. Franco didn't need to tower. He anchored. His small stature never became part of a larger myth because Franco didn't invite myth. He invited obedience. Even in global affairs, he remained slippery. During World War II, he flirted with the Axis powers, allowed Nazi agents safe harbor, and sent Spanish volunteers to the Eastern Front, but never officially joined the war. After it ended, he flipped the narrative. Now Franco was a defender of the West against communism. He made himself useful, and in a Cold War world, usefulness is more valuable than morality. The United States, eager for allies against the Soviet Union, looked the other way. Spain, isolated for years, was welcomed back into international organizations. The dictatorship softened cosmetically, but Franco stayed exactly the same. Quiet, disciplined, unyielding. He aged slowly, shrinking slightly, but still wearing the same uniform, same posture, same expression. As the 1,970 seconds dawned, Franco began to prepare for his own exit, not from power, but from life. He named Juan Carlos, grandson of Spain's last king, as his successor. It was a final irony. The man who had crushed the monarchy would now restore it on his own terms. Franco died in 1975, after an extended illness. Spain, unsure how to react, did everything at once. Mourning, celebrating, reflecting. His tomb, Valle de los Caídos, was monumental, a towering stone basilica built into the mountainside. It looked like the resting place of a giant, which, of course, he was not. But then again, being tall was never the point. And next, we arrive at another short, sharp-edged figure from the same century, Benito Mussolini, standing just 169 centimeters, but spending most of his life trying to stretch that out. A man whose rise was loud, dramatic, and theatrical, but whose height, like his promises, was always just a little exaggerated. Benito Mussolini, Italy. He stood at 169 centimeters, or roughly 5 feet 6.5 inches, not exactly tiny by historical standards, but in Benito Mussolini's case, not tall enough. Not tall enough to loom over crowds. Not tall enough to match the size of his slogans. Not tall enough, apparently, to satisfy the demands of a personality built entirely on theatre, spectacle, and the unrelenting need to appear larger than life. So, he compensated endlessly. If Francisco Franco was small and quiet, Mussolini was short and loud. Where Franco blended into marble, Mussolini posed on balconies, flexed, shouted, marched, rehearsed facial expressions in mirrors. Mussolini didn't just want to be powerful, he wanted to be seen being powerful. And everything about him, from his posture to his propaganda, was an elaborate effort to inflate his physical presence beyond the dimensions he was actually born with. Born in 1,883 inches, Predappio, a small town in northern Italy, Mussolini came from modest beginnings. His father was a socialist blacksmith, his mother a devout Catholic schoolteacher. Benito inherited both, his father's fire and his mother's discipline. He read voraciously, learned quickly, and developed a gift for public speaking, a gift that would later become his entire platform. Early photographs of Mussolini show a wiry, intense young man with sharp cheekbones and an intensity that bordered on unhinged. But as his political ambitions grew, so did his attention to optics. He trained his body into a stiff, chest-out pose. He taught himself to walk with wide, exaggerated strides. He mastered the art of the smouldering glare, that famous lower jaw thrust, eyes glaring up from beneath the brow, as if challenging the very air to disagree with him. All of it carefully calibrated to make you forget his height. By the time he came to national prominence during the chaos following World War I, Mussolini had already ditched socialism and rebranded himself as the prophet of fascism, a political philosophy short on policy and long on aesthetics. Order, strength, national unity, and above all, spectacle. Fascism wasn't just a political system, it was stagecraft. Flags, uniforms, parades, songs, symbols, and Mussolini at the center of it all, striking poses like a Roman statue someone had taken a wire brush to. In 1922, Mussolini marched on Rome, or rather, his followers did. Mussolini himself arrived later by train, but the story stuck. It was the optics that mattered. Shortly after, King Victor Emmanuel III himself, just 153 centimeters tall, incidentally, appointed Mussolini Prime Minister, hoping to stabilize the country. What followed was 2 decades of authoritarian rule, carefully choreographed to look like a Caesar revival on Fast Forward. He made himself Il Duce, the leader. He crafted an entire aesthetic to amplify his presence. The bald head glistening in sunlight, the jutting chin, the chest puffed out like a rooster in a black shirt. Photographers were forbidden from capturing him from below the waist unless he was elevated. He stood on platforms, balconies, tanks, horses, whatever it took to add inches through elevation, if not anatomy. His speeches were performed more than spoken. He would pause mid-sentence to glare at the crowd, beat his chest, or stretch his arms into cruciform poses. He gestured as if trying to seize the very air. People didn't listen to Mussolini to learn anything. They listened to feel something. Energy, authority, control. He didn't tower physically, so he towered emotionally. But behind the curtain of grandeur, the actual mechanics of Mussolini's rule were clumsy, brutal, and increasingly out of step with reality. His economic policies were often contradictory. His campaigns in Africa were bloody and disorganized. His alliance with Hitler, initially reluctant, would ultimately tether Italy to a war it wasn't prepared to fight. And yet, through most of the 1,930 seconds, Mussolini believed the myth he had built. He spoke of restoring the Roman Empire even as he failed to maintain consistent control over his own cabinet. He posed in gladiator gear, commissioned murals that painted him as a colossus. Stories circulated that he was 5'9", 5'10", never mind the actual records that pegged him just under 5'7". His official biographies stretched his height along with his accomplishments. But the taller the myth, the harder the fall. As World War II turned against the Axis powers, Mussolini's illusions began to crumble. His bombastic persona no longer inspired fear, only disbelief. By 1943, Italy was in chaos. Mussolini was arrested, then rescued by German forces. then installed as the puppet head of a phony state in northern Italy. His final years were a tragic parody of his early ambition, still posing, still posturing, but now ignored. He died in 1945, executed by Italian partisans. His body was displayed upside down in a Milan square, a cruel inversion of the man who had spent his entire life trying to rise. And yet, his legacy endures not in admiration, but in caution. He proved that you could inflate yourself into power, that the gap between how tall you are and how tall you appear is politically enormous, but eventually the scaffolding collapses. From one ghost of a collapsed empire to another, we now shift back to France, where Napoleon II, the so-called Duke of Reichstadt, son of the original Bonaparte, lived a life shorter than his own name. Standing 165 to 168 centimeters, he never wore the crown he inherited, but he carried the weight of it. All the same, Napoleon II, Duke of Reichstadt. He was never crowned. He never reigned. He never issued a decree or gave a public address. And yet, Napoleon II, also known as the Duke of Reichstadt, remains one of the most tragic and haunting figures in the royal echo chamber of European history. Standing around 165 to 168 centimeters, about 5 feet 5 to 5 feet 6 inches, he wasn't remarkably short. But in his case, it wasn't his height that was diminished, it was his existence. His entire life was a question mark, cradled in ceremony, suffocated by silence. Born in 1811, Napoleon Francois Charles Joseph Bonaparte came into the world as the long-awaited heir to the French Empire. His father, the original Napoleon declared him King of Rome on the day of his birth. French poets waxed poetic about him. Bonapartist loyalists practically wept at his tiny imperial toes. He was going to be the second coming of empire, a child born not into a family, but into a myth. And then everything fell apart. By the time he was 3, his father had been defeated and exiled, twice. Napoleon Bonaparte, once master of Europe, was now banished to St. Helena, surrounded by British guards and tropical humidity. Napoleon II, meanwhile, was whisked away to Austria with his mother, Marie-Louise, daughter of the Austrian emperor. And this is where the tragedy begins. You would think that being born the heir of the most feared conqueror in Europe might afford a dramatic life. Battlefields, betrayals, at least one romantic scandal. But Napoleon II's life was almost entirely controlled stillness. He was taken in by the Austrian Habsburg court, renamed the Duke of Reichstadt, and effectively erased as a political entity. Not murdered, not imprisoned, just carefully, exquisitely mothballed. They didn't destroy him, they contained him. The Habsburgs kept him surrounded by courtiers, handlers, and carefully designed rituals. His education was military in form, but stripped of ambition. His tutors were told to keep him grounded, politically inert, emotionally dependent. They trained him to be a polite, obedient Austrian noble, anything but a Bonaparte. And yet, the shadow of his father clung to him like a second skin. Napoleon II's mere existence was dangerous. To monarchs across Europe, he was a walking spark, small, quiet, but flammable. Bonapartist sympathizers in France whispered of his return. Propaganda leaflets referred to him as Napoleon II, l'Aiglon, the eaglet. Plays were written, portraits painted. People who had never met him imagined him as a dashing, melancholic figure who would someday cross the Alps and reclaim the empire. But he never did. He couldn't. Because Napoleon II, for all the weight of his name, was not free. He wasn't even allowed to write his own letters without supervision. At court, he was described as intelligent, reserved, and deeply aware of his political situation. He knew who he was, knew what had been taken from him, but instead of rebelling outwardly, he seems to have turned inward. Accounts suggest he admired his father but felt isolated by the comparison. How do you follow in the footsteps of someone who once crowned himself Emperor of the French, when you're 5'6" and under constant watch in Vienna? Even his health reflected the paradox of his life, a body burdened by potential, collapsing under stagnation. In his late teens, Napoleon II began to suffer from what is now believed to be tuberculosis, a slow, wasting illness that drained him of energy and kept him from public life. He grew thinner, paler, weaker. And still, the rumors kept flying. Was he secretly plotting with French royalists? Would he escape? Was he preparing to invade? The answer was no. He was preparing to die. He passed away in 1832 at the age of just 21. No crown, no war, no triumph, just an imperial name slowly fading in a foreign land. His death wasn't tragic because it was violent. It was tragic because it was so profoundly anticlimactic. He was buried in Vienna, and for over a century, his body remained there, forgotten by some, idolized by others, a relic of what could have been. Only in 1940, at the height of World War II, did his remains return to France, moved by Hitler's orders to rest beside his father's tomb in Les Invalides in Paris. Even in death, Napoleon II was a political pawn, his bones used to stoke the coals of nationalism. And so ended the life of the boy who was once declared the King of Rome. His story is a footnote in history books, a side character in the drama of European monarchies, a name most people skip over, but that's exactly why he matters. Because sometimes the most haunting royals are the ones who did nothing, said nothing, ruled nothing, but still carried the unbearable weight of everything. And so we conclude our journey through 25 royals who were, in measurement, surprisingly short, but whose influence, legacy, mystery, or myth was often far taller than they were. From queens and crinolines to emperors in exile, they remind us that height may define presence, but not power. And the smaller the figure, sometimes, the more impossible their shadow.